The chairman does want to give some opening remarks, but just in terms of scheduling, he's going to come in at about 10 to 10 and make some statements. And because we have a schedule and everybody has, things they are packing in, and I appreciate your taking the time to join us today. We're going to get started with the public safety panel. Jennifer Manor is going to moderate that, and she can introduce the panelists. Everybody will be able to do a brief presentation, and then there will be question and answers. And in addition to the moderator asking panelists questions, I encourage other people around the table to feel free to engage in the conversation. Thanks so much for coming.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to hear all of us today. This is an incredibly important issue for the public safety community. As many of you know, we're looking at a lot of these issues in terms of transitioning from a PSTN to more of a digital networks for public safety, and that includes with regards to things such as moving towards next generation 911, towards a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network, next generation alerting, and a number of other important areas. So today we're very lucky to have with us 5 gentlemen with a wealth of experience in this area. So I'm just going to introduce them quickly, and then of course their bios are in the program that was handed out to you at the door, and I really urge you to take a look at them because they all have very, very impressive credentials. So Alan Sadowski, who's to my right, is the Information Technology Manager for the North Carolina State Highway Patrol. Next to him is Dr. Stag Newman from PICSA. How do I say that?
PISCA.
PISCA, sorry. Consulting. Directly next to Dr. Newman is Bill Price, who's the Director for Broadband Programs with the state of Florida. Next to Mr. Price is Dr. Brian Fonce, who's the CEO of the National Emergency Numbering Association. And finally, but certainly not least, is Dr. John Pia, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University and also a consultant. So what we're planning to do this morning is everyone's going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So thank you. So with that, Alan.
So, let's see, get the first slide, please. Well, since they're already counting down the timer, okay, here we go. So disclosure, bottom line is I have to work for a bunch of lawyers, and so I have to make sure that I'm to blame if you don't like anything here. Thank you, but thank you in particular to the first responders in our country. But thank you also to the dispatchers and staff who helped me with this, to the FCC staff, and to you all for paying attention and being here today. My baseline is PSTN, as many public safety agencies know it, is understood to have some aspects of the horse and buggy era. But it's not widely known in public safety how much existing PSTN already uses IP networks. Public safety just wants the phone to work, and we all understand that the PSTN will evolve. The primary mission of public safety is not IT or telephony. It's first response to the public and the communities they serve. And we will respond in rural areas, tribal areas, wilderness, maritime, and park. Even without the telephone network, we'll do our job. The concerns within the community that I canvassed is reliability, affordability, NG911 to include for dispatch centers, and there are a lot of them that are not public safety answering points, concern about the impact on alarm systems and caller ID, and again, rural, tribal, wilderness, and park jurisdictions as we move to an IP network. Additionally, there's competing priorities right now. What is a public safety grade of service? An interesting discussion by itself. A lot of small agencies don't have technical staff, but through a partnership, we can move forward. Some of the advantages, well, one advantage is the redundancy that IP networks can bring. the precedence and priority possibilities that IP networks can bring. But security will become an increasingly important aspect that we don't have with the current PSTN. So it's something that we haven't thought about as much with the old phone networks. An interesting comment that on the emergency management side was, hey, today I can walk out with a lineman's set, grab a pair of wires, get dial tone, and make a call in emergency. I can also do some troubleshooting that way with an IP network. What's the alternative to restoration in an emergency situation? It's clear that the migration will happen. Nobody that I canvassed in North Carolina, at least, said we can't do this. They see it's going to happen. Partnerships are needed. We need full disclosure, education, outreach, and clear what the costs and reliability and functionality. Thank you again for this opportunity. During the, well, I only used 3.5 minutes, so it's a smaller amount of time, but probably at least 2,000 calls to 911 occurred while I've been speaking nationwide. This is our mission, to serve the public. We need a secure, cost-effective, and reliable service, and the public safety communities they serve can benefit from a technology change, but only with patient, willing partnerships with the carrier community. Thank you.
Thank you to Jennifer and the others for inviting me here. And I think Al really set up my talk well, so thank you for talking about the requirements there. Let me make a disclosure. These are only my personal views based on both my experience working on the National Broadband Plan at the Commission here with Jennifer, working on these issues now for a half-dozen years, and also a recent project I did for a nonprofit where I in-depth looked at what would it take to advance NG 911 in this country. So I think the key thing is we have to rethink emergency communications and in effect go from a world of thinking about networks and infrastructure to what are the services that public safety needs to get the reliability, availability, and performance they need. So it's a services-oriented model, not a what do we build as a network. Commercial operators are the network builders. So if I like to leave you with one major point from an implementation standpoint, and then I'll talk about the policy implications at the end, it's that we need to be using the commercial services and commercial infrastructure to meet the public safety needs for 3 reasons. It's the only cost-effective way to do that. I'll get into that a little bit later. It's the only way to get an evergreen network that's constantly modernized, because to modernize modern IP voice, data, wireless, wireline, doesn't matter. There's billions of dollars a year of ongoing funding. And quite frankly, it's the only way to solve interoperability. We've been at an impasse on interoperability for public safety communications for probably decades now. On the other hand, we know how to make our commercial networks interoperate. Our wireless networks do interoperate. So this is a chart from the Public Safety National Broadband Plan with a slight twist at the bottom. It starts with using reinforced broadband commercial wireless infrastructure. Public safety would then purchase services off that infrastructure with additional features and functionality, all of it which are being worked on at the international level. And we need to go with the international technology ecosystems, et cetera, to make it cost effective. Then there are dedicated services on top of that for public safety, followed by in-building solutions, because it's the only way you get deep in-building emergency communications. And then the neat thing today is every vehicle can be its own little cell site. So I'll illustrate that with this. Didn't know this had a build in it. Let me get it built. So in this diagram, what you see is that the ambulance has on top of it a Pico cell, dedicated spectrum probably for the Pico cell, and a directional antenna. Now with a directional antenna, the type of which Verizon, for example, has just announced for their fixed wireless network, you can get to multiple cell sites and you can get far distance and you get high performance. For the people at the incident, running out with their handsets, they communicate not back to a macro cellular site, but back to the Pico cell. So they get good performance into the building, et cetera. Cost of this, probably, if you had volume orders, it's a couple $1,000s to outfit this vehicle. So the technology is going to the point that we can totally rethink going from the LMR, high tower, very few site networks, to every emergency responder vehicle becomes the center of communications at the incident. So technology is going to allow us to do much better communications in the future. Gives us cost savings, access to the latest services because it's driven by commercial implementation, preemption of capacity when needed, interoperability, and the first responders get much better service. I believe, let me switch briefly to the NG911, and I'll let you read the slides at leisure. But I think importantly, one of the insights I got from my NG911 service is if you go to IP networking, which is here today, you get much better, lower costs. Vermont, which is the only state that has a statewide NG911, has an extremely low cost structure for NG911 service, even though they are one of the most rural states in the nation. In Vermont, in Hurricane Irene, they lost no 911 calls. They lost multiple call centers. Had they been on a traditional network, a lot of people would have been out without service, but because the whole state was serving as a single emergency services network, they lost no 911 calls. So part of the message there is each state has its unique needs. You get a few states solving the problem in the leadership position, they become the guidance for all the other states, and that's what this map shows. So sort of the policy lessons that I got that I would recommend is, one, we have to go to public-private partnerships like Al said. It's the only way to do this cost effectively. We cannot rebuild 40, 60,000 cell sites around the country, which is what Verizon, AT&T already have as nationwide carriers. We need a lot of state and local control of that funding because every state needs different. We need federal guidance on the interoperability, and we need some sort of grants to get this going. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Bill Price from the state of Florida, and happy to be here and be part of this talk. I had prepared some slides to give you some background on our division of telecommunications, where I come from, to show you basically what drives our perspectives on some of these issues. So basically, the state of Florida has a $70 billion enterprise, and I work for the division of telecommunications, which has been around for 4 decades. And that business model is a public-private partnership. Oh, there goes my slides, get back. Public-private partnership where the division does competitive procurements, and we award those procurements to the private sector. We've got about 40 contracts. We do about $300 million a year between 911, telecommunications services, and the statewide law enforcement radio network. Our staff does engineering. We do some operational aspects. We do billing. We gather user requirements. We develop procurements. We manage those procurements. We manage those contracts. The benefits to the state is there's no capital required and there's minimal operating expense required. When it comes to broadband, we have a statewide IP MPLS network. It's called My Florida Net. It's been around since 2006. It operates at 5 nines, stringent SLAs with penalties. The primary contract holder is AT&T, and pretty much all the other ILECs in the state are subcontractors to them. We have over 5,400 connections to that backbone network. It includes access, backbone, internet, VRFs, which are virtual private networks, user self-management tools. There's about $7 million in network management tools that come along with the service that users have access to. The speeds are 1 megabit to 1 gigabit. We're in the planning stages now for the next generation of that for IMS. So when it comes to public safety, there's over 100,000 public safety professionals in Florida, 58,000 square miles, 18 million in annual population with 83 million visitors. Our division, we're responsible for communications planning and coordination with our Public Safety Bureau. We do the law enforcement communications plan, E911 planning, we do E911 grants, emergency management communications, and we're responsible for the statewide law enforcement radio network contract. So in Florida today, you've got a lot of local city and county government LMR systems. We've got the statewide LMR system. Ours got about 16,000 radios on it, 98% outdoor, very little indoor coverage. So we have coverage issues. It's procured as a service. We spend about $20 million a year with the contractor for that network. We have implemented P25 in our aircraft network. There are 5 counties that have fully deployed P25. And the good news with all the focus on broadband and public safety is we're all sort of rethinking, how do we throw our assets in? How do we relook at re-accomplishing, public safety communications mission by sharing assets and investments going forward, because frankly, everybody's kind of short on cash. I doubt you can see this, but basically this slide shows the evolution where the state's communications has evolved from many separate contracts for standalone services as technology has evolved, where you've got different contracts and technologies for toll-free and 800 and private line and PRI, and evolving from frame relay, ATM frame relay, and then we came up with the IP/MPLS network. And then over time, what we see happening is many of these services converging into the broadband network. Thank you.
I am one of your slide-free presenters this morning.
Good man.
I want to totally agree with everything my colleagues on this panel have said, and I particularly also appreciate the fact that the TAC came out earlier this year and said that in 2017 it's time to sunset the PSTN. And I always like dates like that because it gives you a target, a goal, and then you begin to realize what needs to be done to achieve that objective. And the TAC had indicated one of the things that need to be done is to ensure that 911 services continue to be available to the public. And so I appreciate that goal, that objective, and I think that the recognition that, in fact, 911 services must continue to be offered to the American public is really front and center, certainly to the public safety initiative with respect to the TAC. A couple of things I just wanted to talk about. I mean, today we look at what's happening in the world of communications, and we have roughly, what I'm looking over here at Matt, there's 310 north of that million wireless connections in the United States. The rapid growth of smartphones, 50, 60 million smartphones in the market, and certainly during the holiday season we'll see that spike. We have Americans today, roughly 54, 55 million Americans with disabilities. We have 30 some odd million Americans that are deaf or hard of hearing that rely on a variety of communication technologies that enable them to communicate with public safety. On our wireless devices, we can send video, voice, data, and some, depending on your network, can do that simultaneously. And yet when it comes to public safety, the ability to utilize that technology in a wireless context is basically lacking. I think we all agree that it's important to have a wireless public safety broadband network. I think we all agree that it is important to ensure that that network remains current, that it is maintained. I loved your term, Stag, that it's evergreen, that the investment into the public safety network, particularly in a broadband world, isn't an investment in 2011 and 12 timeframe, or 13 and 14 realistically, and stays that way for decades. It has to remain current. We also recognize that with the advancement of telecommunication services in the broadband world, many of the services that public safety rely on today, and particularly in the 911 context, in terms of addressing, mapping, and all these types of data points will in large part be applications that'll be riding a broadband network and shared with many users. Going to Stag's point of where there has been next generation 911 networks deployed or near next generation 911 networks, you see the economies and efficiencies. So toward that goal of sunsetting the PSTN, there's a couple of areas where I would like policymakers and individuals to think about in order to make that date a reality. Much of what has been governing the whole provisioning of 911 services at the state level have been under the old tariff regime of the plain old telephone service providers. And I know that's not me because I left my cell phone at home. So, what's happening in that environment? We've had this situation in North Carolina and a few other places across the country where the incumbent LEC requires a payment of a tariff for the provisioning of 911 services, and where the 911 authority has gone to an alternative provider of 911 services, and that 911 authority gets penalized by actually having to pay for both the incumbent tariff provider of the service and then also paying the new provider of 911 services who are offering bigger, better opportunities to communicate in a broadband world. Now, in the world of 911 specifically, the CISRIC, I'm looking over here to Brian Daly. He just, I think, got a few more gray hairs over the last couple of weeks in developing a number of products leading to the CISRIC report that'll be voted on hopefully the 16th of this month, that lists all of the standards work that has been done in the provisioning of next generation 911. And a lot of that work has been done. A lot more still needs to be done. All of this work continues to go forward. All of the effort in trying to ensure that there's a public safety broadband network remains in place. It's time to take a look at what regulatory structures, what funding structures, what incentives could be done to ensure that there is this private partnership with the public safety community to keep, to maintain, build, maintain, and keep that network current. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm John Piha. It's good to be back. Also want to talk about the impact of the transition to IP packet switch networks. I think there are opportunities and challenges here. It's the holiday season. I decided to talk about opportunities. And particular, fit many of the other speakers, the bottom line, this is a time of great transition in both wired and wireless networks to packet switching is a chance for public safety in lots of ways to move from devices and services that were developed just for the smaller public safety market to devices and services that were developed for a large commercial market. And that will mean lower costs, more capabilities, more innovation in lots of ways. You can use commercial IP-based services in many ways in public safety. Let me start by talking about using them for first responders. Assuming Congress makes this possible, we will soon see public safety and cellular providers moving forward, deploying 4G networks with the exact same technology for the first time, IP over LTE, which is an amazing opportunity. We can have, for the first time, devices going back and forth between public safety networks and commercial networks without major disruption. And that will give you better capacity, that will give you better coverage, that will give you better dependability. If we create the right environment, it may not happen all by itself. So let's talk a little bit about that. There have actually, I'm going to pull from a couple of studies that have come out of Carnegie Mellon University with my university hat on in the last 2 years. The first one in 2010 looked at the technical aspects of priority roaming for public safety. One thing we found is that, well, first of all, LTE has a very rich set of priority-related mechanisms that can effectively meet a wide range of public safety needs. That's all good news if they're given access. Something not on my slides, and I wish were, we've lately, universal service context, been talking about supporting wireless networks in unserved areas. Seems to me if a carrier is getting a dime of taxpayer money to roll out an LTE network in an unserved area, it ought to support priority roaming services for public safety. Still, we need, there are some other things we need to pay attention to. One is having LTE on both kinds of networks is a great start to interoperability, but by itself it may not be sufficient to ensure commonality among the countless agreements I would expect to emerge. So some more thought needs to be done in terms of common understanding. I also think we need public safety voice in the standards bodies if we're going to meet long-term needs as they change over time. And one entity, not 50,000, maybe ought to have the authority and the expertise to speak for public safety in those forums. On the economic side, we found that roaming is more cost-effective, even if public safety is paying commercial rates, more cost-effective than dedicated public safety infrastructure if the utilization 24/7 over a 10-year period is less than 10%. And from what we know of public safety usage patterns, that's very likely to be true. So that says, on average, it is very likely that paying commercial rates for roaming can save public safety money in addition to all the other benefits. Now, on average may not be enough. We don't want to see huge charges that go beyond annual budgets and force public safety agencies to sort of ration usage. So we look beyond the average. If you look at even really horrible localized emergencies, we looked at terrorist attacks in a DC metro station or at Penn Station in Manhattan in midday. You see that roaming costs are still 2 orders of magnitude less than overtime costs. Probably not going to break the bank for a localized emergency. A wide-scale emergency like a hurricane is different, though. That really can add up to big money. I would suggest we think when we look at these agreements, maybe capping what public safety has to pay per day in a wide-scale emergency. Perhaps you trigger it when the governor or the president declares a state of emergency. There are that's first responders. There are lots of other ways that commercial services are going to be useful. I don't have time to talk about it, but I think the prospects of using commercial IP-based services to interconnect PSAPs can be greatly beneficial. There's a lot to learn from commercial call centers, even though the problem isn't exactly the same. There are a lot of commonalities to improve resilience. Also, consumers using IP-based phone services to call 911 is the places where I see challenges. There are issues of reliability and quality of service that I don't have time to talk about, but I guess maybe in the workshop next week, which I think will hit this. So I'll just summarize. This is a chance, again, to embrace technologies that are widely available for commercial use, to lower costs, to expand capabilities, and to get more rapid innovation for public safety.
Before we open up the floor for questions, I was just going to ask a couple of questions. First, most of the speakers touched on reliability, and I wanted to explore for a moment and touched upon, I should also say, the use of commercial services for public safety, whether it's for day-to-day use by emergency responders or for commercial use, which is how 911 is carried today and will continue to be carried. So my question is, what could we do to improve the reliability of the commercial networks and the public safety networks in these public-private partnerships to ensure they're public safety grade? So, gentlemen.
Well, I think right now, the public, let's distinguish between wireline and wireless, first of all. The wireline IP infrastructure in the U.S. is, fiber-based, resilient rings, is reliable enough to meet the needs of the Federal Reserve, which I've been told if that network goes down for a few hours, the country is bankrupt. So that network is actually far more reliable than any of the public safety networks we have today by orders of magnitude. The Defense Department is using commercial underlying facilities, et cetera. So the question is really one of purchasing the necessary reliability. And we saw in Vermont a wonderful example of using an IP infrastructure, how resilient that network was. For the wireless network, for example, in this model where the first responder vehicle is at the incident with directional antennas, it will be able to get to multiple antenna sites in almost all locations except the most rural area. That gives you far more reliability than just hardening an individual site. So with these new architectures, it's far more cost effective to get there. Now, there may be some well use of federal grant money to, put in extra cell sites in a certain spot or do some hardening or making sure everything's on fiber rings, but that's a far better use of money than building a whole new network that inherently will be far less reliable.
Well, public safety uses the private commercial sector now for 911 centers, call centers now, like you said, and through your contracts you can get high levels of performance and guarantees. There is a big difference, though, in the wireless side between the way the commercial sector is designed and engineered for 4-hour interruptions on battery versus weeks in the event of a hurricane where everything is blown down. So from our perspective, to get this right, we have to make sure that public safety's requirements are front and center as we go about however we do this, whether they're built privately and run privately or whether they're bought as a service from the public sector. It all comes down to obtaining public safety's requirements and making absolutely sure that they're front and center as it gets built.
Again, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think one of the things that can be done, I'm just trying to figure out what's the best bang for the buck to ensure that the consumers have access to public safety via 911, and how those public safety officials can communicate. And I think we all agree that it's the wireless part of it that is perhaps the most challenging, to ensure that there's the reliability needed by public safety, the coverage needed by public safety. And I do believe that, if you're dealing with just sheer costs alone, what model is going to present the most cost-effective means of ensuring, one, coverage, and ensuring the availability of service. And I think that, Stagg, you'd mentioned that there needs to be perhaps directing of funds where necessary to strengthen or to build out where commercial interests may not have the right economic incentives to build out. But I think we also need to sit down and start figuring out what incentives could be used for the commercial world to build to a public safety standard, rather than thinking solely in terms of what regulations can be imposed on a carrier in the provision of services. I think that there could be investment credits and other things to ensure that the infrastructure is being built, that there is some, in essence, reward, if you were to look at it that way, to build to that standard needed by public safety, and to ensure that public safety's needs are addressed in that process.
I think often the answer to how do we get the reliability public safety needs is going to be redundancy. If you are, I had a company a number of years ago that offered financial services, and it wasn't quite the Federal Reserve, but needed to be incredibly reliable. It's very simple. We had 2 carriers offering us service, and neither of them failed very often, and the chances of both of them failing was very remote. A PSAP can do the exact same thing. In wireless networks, first responders, even if one's commercial carrier is not as reliable to meet public safety networks, if you have the ability to roam to 3 different commercial carriers plus a dedicated public safety network, your overall dependability is very high. So that will work for many things. There are a few cases where you've only got one provider, and there's a rural area, or consumers actually may often only have one provider, and then we may have to worry more, I think, about the things Brian talked about.
Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead, sorry.
I was going to just say, and I think done right, it becomes a win-win, because if the cellular networks are more reliable, then enterprises are more willing to move their mission-critical applications onto the cellular network also. So we think through this properly. I think there can be very cost-effective uses of resources where we all win in this.
I think this whole discussion is an interesting debate, because in reality, you take a look at public safety, and public safety for years has been we own, we control, we operate our networks, we build to the standards that we need. And it's served public safety well. And then now we're in an environment where let's really figure out what is the most effective means of ensuring that public safety has communication networks that are built, maintained, and remain current. And the opportunity to do partnerships with the private sector is an opportunity to strategically invest, if you will, public safety monies where it is necessary to invest it. So it's a sea change in thinking. And as a result of that sea change in thinking, you're also going to find other things happening, I believe, in the public safety world. And I think you're going to see competition develop for products and services. Certainly in a broadband world, you're going to see a number of applications that'll be applicable to public safety writ large, and applications that will be developed unique for particular locations. And all of that will benefit public safety's response to emergency situations. There's no question about it. So reliability, when we talk about the network, funding, when we talk about who's going to pay for it, the distinction between wireless and wireline, and a lot of this is built on the foundation of a sea change in thinking within the public safety community regarding how they're going to rely on broadband services in the future.
Right, so thank you. So I just want to play the devil's advocate for 1 minute. And the question I would have is, during the recent East Coast earthquakes, there was severe congestion that was reported on the wireless networks. And public safety came out afterwards and said we had no congestion on our networks. Everything operated fine. So how do we best address those situations where everyone's calling at the same time?
Well, that's an apples to oranges comparison, right? Because the commercial networks, the congestion on the commercial networks was caused by all of the people, commercial customers calling, whereas you didn't have that same phenomena because the first responders were taking care of their day-to-day business. They didn't have a huge spike in calling. But the key point I think I really want to make is that was congestion on a conventional circuit switch cellular network. We're not to the LTE IP-based network where you can have priority in an IP-based network in the same way in the wireline. In the wireline world, 911 calls get priority over everything else. In an LTE wireless network, that same phenomenon will happen. So the 911 calls and the first responder calls will get priority. All the other calls will get dropped on the floor. Furthermore, the voice calls, the critical calls that need to go through in an LTE data-rich world will be a small percentage of the total capacity, and so giving those voice calls priority will be easy.
You know, it was really quite interesting. For somebody who grew up in the West and to have an earthquake out here in Washington, D.C. area was really rather interesting. So we evacuated the building, went downstairs in this little park in front of our building. And what I found to be most interesting, I looked around and frankly, many of the younger folks, which is, I think, just a phenomenon of the way they communicate, the social networking, the data networks worked fairly well. And in fact, we were getting information about damages in other areas of the city via the social network. And, you know, it's a whole different way of communicating that's taking place out here, and that has to have some applicability in the public safety context. And I think as we look to the broadband IP capabilities of these networks, to have that functionality also play in the public safety context, I think is critically important.
So one question on standards. Many of you brought up, and I think John brought up at the end, how there should be one entity that would represent public safety in the standards bodies, from someone who's been in the commercial industry and knows that generally in the standards body, market power actually does play a role in who gets their view. How do you handle that best with regards to public safety requirements?
One of the things that certainly public safety gets hurt by is the lack of standards. And I won't enumerate them, but there are plenty. But and the marketplace approach, I agree, is a viable. There needs to be some policy or process by which proprietary mechanisms aren't allowed into the public safety play. Otherwise, we're going to have special feature sets or capabilities only if you go to this vendor. So it's something that public safety needs to get better educated and stand up to the table and accept the fact that we aren't going to have this latest and greatest little function or feature, but it's so that we can support the mission and we can have full interoperability. That's the standard side that I'd be more concerned with on the day-to-day mission support role.
The market power issue is one of the reasons why I think there ought to be one voice. Standards bodies are not going to take very seriously a small town in Wisconsin who describes their needs. They don't have any market power. But public safety collectively is a market that companies will pay attention to. And if they get together and work out what their needs are offline and then approach the public safety or the standards bodies, they will be listened to.
I'm mindful that the chairman will be here shortly, Lisa. Let me open anyone have questions from the floor? If you do, can you raise your hand or come up to the microphone, I guess? Okay, so I will ask another question. So this is a thought question. If you absolutely had to reach another individual at this moment for public safety reasons, which would be more effective, the PSTN or broadband wireless? And let's go down the road on this one.
Well, I'd try the PSTN first out of convenience, the user interface. That's my first step. I mean, if I was at home, I'd be using my own LMR radio, but
I think if I absolutely had to reach somebody on an emergency, my first attempt would be to use the cellular network, because that's what I've got with me, a cellular phone. Well, actually, I've got two wireless devices. I've got an iPad, so I can try to get a data message, and I've got and probably I'm going to call their cellular phone.
I would do the same thing and probably try and send a text message next.
Ditto, I would use my wireless device.
I'm sorry to say, I think the wired PSTN would be much more reliable, but like so many Americans, if I'm home, I don't have access to one, so I'd have no choice but to use wireless. Wireless there will always be connection issues that we can't solve, but I think the IP-based wired connections also are still probably a little less reliable, and there are some things we can work on there.
I think the key point that sort of came out in this is we have a much higher chance of getting to that person we have to reach an emergency now than we did 15 or 20 years ago, where we just used the PSTN, because we've got multiple ways to reach them, and we've got multiple ways to communicate. So we're going to text, we're going to call their cell phone, we're going to call their wireline phone, and somehow we'll probably get through. So it's reliability through diversity.
Can I just add to that, please? One of the things, I looked across to Norman and Jennifer, and I just had a situation with a friend of mine in Los Angeles who is deaf, who he thought a cardiac incident, and the only way he could communicate was trying to text to someone to call 911. And, so people are going to do what is just second nature to them in their communication needs and in their particular time of need. So in that situation, you have to be sensitive to and aware of and factor into the whole provisioning of public safety services, the capabilities that people come to rely on in their ability to communicate. So just wanted to raise that point.
So I wanted to follow up actually on a point that Brian made earlier about the use of incentives. And one of the issues that I think is very important to consider as we're in this transition is how do you get the services out to very rural areas? And so my question was really going to be how do you achieve service coverage on a cost-effective basis to the most rural areas? But I would also say Brian's point on incentives to increase network reliability, I'm sure could also work in terms of incenting folks to reach the most rural areas, both for public safety but also for making sure there's access to 911. No one touched on satellite and the use of other technologies to kind of get to rural areas. So I wanted to put out a general question on that.
I have a mission focus that is largely rural with some tribal and wilderness, and it's a daily challenge for the responders with their LMR systems to get the coverage. The rural citizens deserve just as much a capability as somebody in the city. How do you incentivize that? That's a business question because ultimately that's who's going to have to build it out. So I'm working in the partnership with the carriers to build it out. Satellite, I see more and more people do it, but I also see people frustrated by satellite because of the latencies, including our first responders. It has a place. I don't want to put it down, but for day-to-day phone conversation, that would be tough for a lot of people. For texting or for email, fine. It's a problem that I wrestle with, and until we have a wider scale build-out, the Commerce with BTOP money, we put in 1,700 miles of fiber in North Carolina, primarily for rural. So I've got hopes that we're going to be able to do better there, but it's a difficult one. How do you put fiber into rock? I mean, mountainous North Carolina, I can certainly relate to large parts of the western part of our country. Putting fiber in the ground is, when it's rocky, it's not cheap. So there's a lot of issues, and we've got to come to some resolution because our citizens deserve it.
Jennifer, one way to get there is through contractual commitments and revenue. Sorry. One way to get there is through contractual commitments and revenue. And that's what we do at the state, right? So we procure, broadband services statewide regardless of where you are, right? And if we get an order, then, the contract holder goes out and provisions it. And rarely are there special, cost provisions, but in the wireless world, we would anticipate that there are going to be increased costs, and we will have to have the money. I mean, it comes down to money, basically, right? So to get that kind of coverage.
I agree. I think there can be certainly the incentives in terms of tax credits, investment credits, and so forth, certainly the contractual requirements imposed. And I think also, if I were concerned, I looked down at Steve Berry, who represents a lot of the rural wireless folks, and I've had conversations with other federal agencies that looked at the provisioning of wireless services to a point, and they actually wanted to provide services beyond that point to some of these agencies. And the agencies themselves may be more incented, if you will, to help build out on the original infrastructure presented by the commercial entity. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to get more bang for the buck, if you will, and to capitalize on the investment made in the commercial context to bring it out further to rural areas for specific needs, or to ensure that through contract arrangements, or to provide additional incentives to cover rural areas, I think are some of the ideas that should be at least considered or talked about.
I think it's mostly been said, but just to briefly expand on Brian's point, it does come down to money, but yeah, those partnerships between commercial entities and public safety, we did a lot of this at the National Broadband Plan to see that there are remarkable savings if you work together, and if you work together early in the build-out phase as opposed to much later in the process.
Let me just sort of give you a specific example of how we might think about that. In the National Broadband Plan, we talked about a fleet of deployables that would be particularly available in rural area. In almost all rural areas, we have unlit spectrum. Let's turn the public-private partnership around. The other thing we have in almost all rural areas is high-site LMR systems. You don't want high-site LMR systems for your day-to-day commercial network. You want 40,000 low-site. But for an overlay in rural areas, using some of the unused spectrum because spectrum's not lit up, maybe we give it that thin overlay, these deployable vehicles with high gain antennas, all of a sudden, when we got an incident in the middle of nowhere, you get the vehicle out there, you got it. Ultimately, satellite's the ultimate backup, but we could do a lot just with creative public-private partnerships.
Okay, so, yep. Okay. So I'm going to thank our panelists, and the chairman is here, so we're going to turn the floor over to him. So thank you very much, and if everyone could join me.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for that overly generous introduction. No, seriously, good morning. And welcome to the initial telephone network and transition workshop. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of people who continue to give their time to public service to help us wrestle through these issues of tremendous importance to our country and our economy. So thank you all for participating in this. I want to thank a few people to begin, Tom Wheeler and the members of our Technical Advisory Council, which has done just such excellent work in helping us think through how to unleash the opportunities of advanced communications infrastructure to drive economic growth and innovation. All the people on TAC, some of whom are here today, have contributed real time and energy and brilliance to the process, and I appreciate it. I want to particularly thank the TAC Critical Transitions Working Group, which helped develop the topics and goals for these workshops. And so what we're seeing is groups of outside advisors coming in, working with our staff, thinking through what the big issues and opportunities are, and driving a process to help us develop the policies that we need. I want to thank the other panelists who are here, who've traveled in some cases across the country to help participate in this discussion. I want to welcome the public safety and disability access communities and thank you for participating. We're in the middle of a period of just excellent workshops and forums. We had an international forum here yesterday that we hosted that included over 300 participants from 30 different countries discussing how to unleash advanced communications for people with disabilities and seniors. We're having a similar session tomorrow. We're having this session today, and it really is the FCC playing its proper role. Commissioner Ann Boyle from Nebraska is here. Where is my friend Commissioner Boyle? She will be here later. But we're so pleased that Ann is able to come and participate. Commissioner Boyle was a tremendous help in our universal service reform efforts. She does extraordinary work in Nebraska, and it's terrific to have one representative from the states participating in these discussions, particularly in Commissioner Boyle, someone who is so knowledgeable and focused on these issues. The world is changing. Our market is transitioning away from the traditional switch network, what we fondly call POTS, to an IP network. Already, as you know, 19% of the nation's telephone connections are interconnected VoIP, and nearly 30% of Americans have cut the cord and rely only on wireless telephones. The transition from POTS to IP is unleashing innovation, applications, generating consumer benefits that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. What we used to call the networks of the future have become the networks of today. This technological evolution is contributing to our economy and to job creation today. It's helping improve education and healthcare. It's advancing public safety. And the opportunities in each of these areas for the future are immense. These changes are happening quickly. We've been focused here, as you all know, on accelerating these changes, accelerating broadband, wired and wireless. And indeed, the change from the old world to the new is happening even faster than many had predicted. Of course, the challenge is that our country won't move seamlessly from one basic communications technology platform to another without real thought and planning. And that's what the workshops today and on December 14th are focused on. This is the core point that TAC made to us in its recommendations, which is this transition is happening. We want it to happen. We want to accelerate it. But we have to treat it as a transition that raises issues and policy concerns that we need to address together. And of course, the core question is, how do we make this transition from PSTN to IP services in a way that best serves our country, that promotes innovation, promotes investment, fosters competition, and that protects consumers? So some of the questions that I expect that you'll address in this workshop in addition to that umbrella question, how do we minimize consumer disruption moving from where we've been to where we want to go? How do we continue to ensure public safety and access to emergency services? Preserve and enhance disability access, promote ubiquitous access, ensure high service quality, unleash innovation. The Commission has already begun to address some of these issues with the help of many people here. For example, on October 27th, as many of you know, we adopted a significant forward-looking reform to our high-cost universal service program and intercarrier compensation rules. We've modernized our E-rate program to reflect new opportunities to use technology for learning. We recently adopted rules to make sure that people with disabilities have access to modern communications, such as VoIP, and we've freed up spectrum so that it's available for innovative services, and of course we're working to free up substantially more. These actions, along with others, have helped accelerate change, and they've made the need to address the transition from an all-IP network even more urgent. At the Commission, we'll continue to develop policies and rules that stimulate innovation, create jobs, promote competition. We all know that the PSTN has done a great job achieving certain objectives. It's reliable, the quality of voice communications is generally high. Looking backwards, the universalization of our telephone system helped tie businesses and communities together in the United States in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and helped drive commerce and success in the 20th century. Telephone system helped save lives in the 20th century. Our challenge together is to make sure that our new communications platform does that in the 21st century, and that we transition from there to here in a way that continues to promote the same values and the same kinds of outcomes. We don't want to lose any of the benefits that the traditional telephone system has provided us. We want to capture those and more in the future. There are reasons why consumers have chosen to migrate to IP-based offerings and mobile services, high-speed data, video, mobility. Of course, our task is to ensure that we have the right policies in place to enable the private sector to take the best features of the PSTN, reliability, accessibility, etc., into the future, while also capturing the many advantages of new technology. So that brings me to today's workshop, the first of two workshops this month, analyzing, discussing the telephone network in transition. These workshops represent an effort to look broadly at many different issues that affect or are affected by the transition to IP technology. They represent the next step in our ongoing efforts to support and prepare for new technologies and services. Today's workshop will be discussing public safety, disability access, stranded assets, and rural issues. Next week, we'll be hearing from a wide range of thinkers about the policy, economic, and technical issues associated with the transition. I'm very pleased by the participation that we have in this workshop, but I know will be a serious engagement in some very hard, very important issues for the country. And it would not surprise me. In fact, I think this is fine at some level if these conversations quickly get to a point where most Americans wouldn't understand what we're talking about. That's okay, as long as we keep in mind the core objectives, which are ones that all Americans will understand: promoting economic growth on this platform and innovation, promoting public safety, promoting access for people with disabilities, promoting the interests of consumers and businesses all across the country. So I wish you well. I thank you for this workshop. I'll be getting regular reports on how things are going. And I see enough people around the room who understand our processes well enough to know that there is a way to take this work and help us turn them into actions that will substantially advance these goals. We're not interested in debating societies or theoretical sessions. We want to make sure that we're harnessing these opportunities for all Americans, and the truth is we can't do it without your help. So thank you for giving your time to this. Thank you to the FCC staff. I see many of them here and around the room who've worked very hard on this. They do it because they know how valuable this can be, and I wish you well. I hope you have a good day, and I look forward to progress coming out of these workshops. Thank you.
Is this working now? Yeah. I know some people do have to flow in and out, and I appreciate your time, but feel free to stay if you are able to. We're going to start the next panel, which is the Disability Access and Substitute Services. Greg Leibach is going to be moderating, and I'll let him introduce the panelists. Thanks very much.
Is this one? This one's working. Let's try this again. Good morning, everyone. I am Greg Leibach. I'm the Chief of the Disability Rights Office here at the Federal Communications Commission. As Chairman Janikowski just said, I would like to, as he just said, excuse me, I would like to express my appreciation for the leadership from all of you guys, your expertise, as well as for those who hosted this event. We really want to increase awareness, not just for folks on the outside, but for those of us who work here. For those of us who work on disability-related issues, it's not just DRO now. It kind of used to be that way, where just the Disability Rights Office worked on disability-related issues. Believe it or not, the issue has spread throughout the entire commission. Everyone on every floor of this building, thanks to Janikowski's leadership, is now aware of disability-related issues. I would also like to thank specifically the Wireline Competition Bureau, as well as the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, for arranging for this workshop, a much-needed workshop, I might add. What we have here today is a very impressive team of experts sitting over here to my right, and I would like to just give a quick little introduction of them. I don't want to steal their thunder, so I want them to do the majority of the talking. When I first came to the FCC 10 years ago, we had monthly reports from the TRS Fund Administrator, the Telecommunications Relay Services Fund Administrator. And on that report, it would show the minutes of use for the various forms of relay. At the time, it was an average of 4 million minutes a month for TTY-based relay service, traditional TRS. TTY-based relay relies on the PSTN. Today, those monthly reports average about 450,000 minutes a month for that form of relay. There's been a steep decline during my time here at the Commission. One of the major factors for that is the very quick migration over to IP-based services. As a deaf individual, I can see that people who are deaf, hard of hearing, for example, are very adaptive to whatever new technology comes up on the market. They very quickly migrate to that as long as that technology provides access. And around 2003, when video phones for deaf individuals really were launched, it was almost an overnight success for this community. Many folks migrated away from their TTYs over to video phones, which are IP-based. One thing I would say, however, that's still missing, at least from about 2003 to 2008, so for the first 5 years or so of video phone access, there was no 911 access for those individuals who used video phones, because you cannot dial 911 using a video phone system until the FCC kind of forced it with a Band-Aid solution through a numbering system. Right now, relay services have to handle relay 911 calls to the various PSAPs, but there's no direct video access to 911 centers. So again, it's a Band-Aid, if you will. It's not the solution. The goal is for there to be direct access for these callers to the PSAPs. Thanks to the leadership of Cheryl King, who moderates the EAC, Emergency Access Advisory Committee here at the Commission, who soon will be proposing its recommendations for such access. Thanks to her work, this really is on the radar screen. This is necessary for folks with disabilities, specifically those who use IP-based services. So some of the issues that were discussed in the previous panel will now shift over to you guys. Some carry over, some new issues. Here on this panel, we have Jennifer Simpson. She is the co-founder and co-chair of the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology. Jennifer and I have to admit, we go way back. She was my colleague here for a while at the Commission when I first came in, so it's always good to see Jennifer. We also have Paul Schrader. He's a regular here at the Commission as well, I will admit. He's with the American Foundation of the Blind, and he is the Vice President, of Policies and Programs. We also have Mark Uncapfer, with Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA. He's the Director of Regulatory and Government Affairs. Norman Williams. He is a senior research engineer at Gallaudet University at their Technology Access Program. We also have Matthew Gerst from CTIA. He's counsel with CTIA, and I will also mention an encounter I had with him in Atlanta in the airport back in June, if you remember that. Yeah, okay, you're smiling. I'm guessing you did. I had a layover. I was trying to come back from the TDI convention in Austin, Texas, and had to go through Atlanta. I was waiting for my plane. Matthew approached me, was trying to communicate with me. He had his handheld, an IVR app on his handheld, communicating through like an avatar, if you will, a sign language avatar. He would type in text, and it would turn it into sign language on his phone. So that's how we had a communication at the gate in Atlanta. It's somewhat of a substitute for an interpreter, if you will. At least it works for us at the gate. All right, so we'll proceed. Let you guys. I guess we'll open with Jennifer.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Greg, for inviting me. I very much appreciate being asked, and that the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology could be part of this, the input for this very important issue. Is it the death of dial tone, or what is it? CODE has over 317 member organizations, and we're in almost every state. And these consumers are very interested in disability access issues when it comes to technology. As you know, as many know, we were formed and were instrumental in advancing the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. Any transitions in the network are very important to our community to know about, because we always have a fear of loss of access. As Brian Fontes mentioned, there are at least 50 million people with disabilities in the United States. This includes people with hearing disabilities, vision disabilities, speech disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and other mental health disabilities. We also know, too, that there are many elderly people in the population in America. Elderly people is aging, and people obviously have concerns with communications technologies as they age. There's also children with disabilities, and many people whose language is not English as their first language. And most of these people may be very often unaware of the technologies involved in the telephone network. We may know words like cordless, wireline, landline, and wireless. We may know about ISP. We may have bought a bundled package of services like TV, phone, and internet. But this doesn't mean I know, or they know, what's going on in the network at all, what's behind the scenes, as it were. I may have DSL, and I might have Wi-Fi. I might have VoIP, voice over internet phone system at work. But how it's all connected, and if something gets changed, such as an upgrade or a technology shift, most really won't know what you're talking about, and you know what? They won't really care. Most don't know what the PSTN is. Most may just see all forms of networks as one big communication system that they want to be able to use and access at any time. We don't know what a tariff issue is. We don't know about roaming and how that might work for the 911 system. Many don't even know what a PSAP is, but I can tell you we all want to be able to get to 911 wherever we are at any time using whatever technology we have. So in any transition plan and scheme, there needs to be a really good consumer education piece in place. I think that's the one key thing that when I started to think about this, that we needed to be saying here. I'm thinking backwards on the digital TV transition and how important that was to know what was going on. So I think the FCC needs to look at this from the same perspective. I did a little mini survey of some of the folks at the COAT Coalition around the issues that might be involved with with the shifts in the telephone network. The very first one that came up, obviously, was relay services. And the very first one that was mentioned was captioned phone service and two-line phone services that were used, and connection via 711 to relay services. People said, well, if there's going to be changes, will all those still work? And what about speech-to-speech service? My friends from the speech-disabled community asked me, will that also be working? So we're very concerned about what we already have in terms of relay services and what changes in the network might mean, particularly for people who rely on the wireline forms of relay service. You mentioned the switch with TTY users. Well, it's not just TTY users, there's all kinds of other forms of relay now that our community will be concerned about when there are changes in the behind the scenes of the network. 911 issues came up. People don't always know what is involved there, but they're very concerned that they wouldn't have access. Voice quality came up, particularly for people who strongly rely on voice. Is the network going to have good quality voice? Several times VoIP was mentioned as having bad quality, dropping of voices, compression of voices, and how difficult that makes understanding in phone calls. People with speech disabilities specifically mentioned that. There were battery concerns. If I have to use wireless, how will I charge my battery on my cell phone? And that's one of the reasons people gave for not giving up landline. I myself haven't given up the landline at my house because the transformers, the electrical system goes off in my neighborhood whenever there's some sort of big weather event, and we're always concerned that we wouldn't be able to use 911. Drop call concerns came up, particularly in rural areas. We know there are higher numbers of people with disabilities in rural areas, so that's an issue. I have one more point I want to make. Accessibility issues. People were raising issues around what we'd already gained under Section 255 and under the new 21st CVA requirements in regard to the networks. If there's a big transition, are we going to lose things? What will happen? How will the transition occur for that? Hearing aid compatibility and the accessibility of phone devices themselves came up here in this conversation. Technical support. Somebody said to me, when my ISP goes down or my cell phone doesn't work or the TV service isn't working, what do I use to get it fixed? I call on a landline. So this is a very critical issue, how this is handled. Some other issues came up, credit issues. Apparently wireline phone numbers are often used to verify credit or authenticate who people are. This is a real issue in our community where people may have little or no credit. Cab calling. Our community uses public transportation a lot for obvious reasons. So if you need to call a cab, you can't always get a cab apparently to answer a wireless phone call, although they will answer a call on a fixed line. So that's a concern. Confusion issues by our community, especially people who are elderly or with intellectual disabilities. Some of these people still need dial tone built into their wireless phones so that they know what their phone is all about. A lot of people don't know who to go get something fixed with, so they rely on fixed line systems to do that, or they find a neighbor who has the fixed line. Somebody also said to me about directory issues. If I have wireless or I'm forced to have it, somebody said to me, how will people find me because there's not a directory for wireless numbers? Somebody also said to me, will I lose my access to the internet? I have DSL in my house, which apparently is coupled with their landline service. So that was a concern, internet issues. I will end there, but I could certainly submit some written statements to support this.
Thanks, Jennifer. I just want to be fair to everyone else. Don't worry, you'll have obviously an opportunity to, there'll be discussion during the Q&A section. Thank you. Moving on to Paul.
Thank you. Paul Schrader with the American Foundation for the Blind. Thanks for the opportunity to address this topic. Just a couple of quick notes. The American Foundation for the Blind provides services and information to people with vision loss and the professionals who serve them, so we are very interested in technology-related topics, of course, and telecommunications topics. We have indeed worked long and hard on a number of issues here at the Federal Communications Commission, so it is beginning to feel a little bit like a home away from home. I was just here yesterday, in fact, talking about the CVAA, so it is good to be back talking about a different issue. One of the points that we want to reiterate that I think Jennifer raised, and that is the number of people with disabilities who are seniors, and that is particularly true for people with vision loss. Estimates that generally are agreed on say that there are about 25 million Americans experiencing enough vision loss that it does affect their daily lives. Now, the high number of those individuals still have some usable vision. Some have considerable usable vision, but the point is that vision loss does affect activities of their daily lives for that number. The majority of those individuals are older, are seniors, and most of those individuals lose their sight with aging. The highest, the conditions that are most likely to cause vision loss are highly associated with aging, such as macular degeneration, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy, and of course cataract remains a cause. All of those highly associated with aging. I stress that point for the same reason that Jennifer did, and that is that this is a group who are, first of all, they're already adjusting to the loss of vision, and they're not necessarily able to make rapid adjustments as somebody who loses sight or another sense earlier in life can. For these individuals, changes in technology do become very significant and often problematic. We've done a couple of surveys, and I will sort of point out that without giving specific numbers, because I don't have them handy, people have tended to like certain things. We didn't ask specifically about the public switch telephone network or POTS or whatever, but we do know that people tend to like stable and predictable interfaces. And in fact, we just did an article, and I would refer folks who are interested to a publication called Access World, which is available on the AFB, American Foundation for the Blind website at afb.org. And in this current issue, there's an article about a survey that we did of individuals with vision loss. And a high number of individuals really like having tactile keys. And it's one of the points that I want to visit for a second, because the value of the user interface, the simple, straightforward user interface in our current touch-tone phone environment on the public switch network is one that even as individuals lose their sight with age, that adjustment is easy to make because individuals are comfortable with that interface. And again, while we didn't specifically ask about the telephone network, we were asking about technologies in general and what people's expectations were. There was a high interest in tactile keys. One of the things that it's sort of a funny memory that I have, and I just want to quickly point out that we've spent a lot of time over the years making sure people were comfortable with changes in the telephone network. And indeed, when I was reading the biography of the children's author, autobiography of the children's author Beverly Cleary to my daughters, I remember her talking about the switch from operator-assisted phones to dial phones, and how they would come to the schools in the 1920s and teach kids how to use this newfangled dial phone. And of course, the same thing when we moved to the now ubiquitous push-button system. So as we make any changes, we're certainly going to have to think through how do we make sure that this interface is not only understood by individuals, but is accessible to people who are used to having a predictable interface. The same is true for response. Jennifer mentioned dial tone. I think one of the things that people obviously find valuable in the current system is a predictable response. You pick up the phone and there's a dial tone, you understand what to do. Many individuals are still flummoxed by the wireless and in some instances VoIP-based systems that don't necessarily have, in the case of wireless, don't have a dial tone and aren't sure how to handle that. People can make that transition, but we need to make sure that that is something that we're aware of. High quality voice, already been mentioned. Ubiquitous is obvious. Access to information, one of the things that's been valuable about the widespread deployment of the public switch telephone network is that most individuals with vision loss and in some cases other disabilities are able to get free access to information services, information lookup services, which has been very helpful for people with vision loss to have. I do want to close by noting that as we move to inexorably, people have made this switch to wireless and VoIP, and there are lots of reasons why people are making that switch. And indeed, we're seeing that some of that in the disability community for much the same reason. But there really is a fear that when one needs to have a very quick access to key information, such as in an emergency, the phone is really the first place to turn. The PSTN is the first place to turn, because it's a user interface that people know how to use in a crisis without much thought. It's predictable in terms of the interface and in the response. And finally, of course, has been noted, the voice quality is high. So we have to take these things into consideration, and we look forward to further conversation about this as you move forward on your whatever proposal the Commission is going to make.
Thanks, Paul. Moving down the line, Mark.
Thank you very much, Gregory. I have there we go. I do have a presentation. I wanted to kind of jump through the early part. I know in every broadband presentation now with copy, there's about 15 seconds of commercials, so I will go through it very quickly. But one of the things I did want to highlight is the role of standards. TIA is a standards organization, and I understand there's kind of a tension between proprietary standards, which are a source or a incentive for innovation, and the sort of broadly interoperable standard issue. It's essential to be able to create the incentives for new products and services to create to have that opportunity to be incorporated. TIA is a organization that facilitates standard setting in the telecommunications industry. This is a difficult slide to read, but it's one that's worth paying some attention to. Sometimes we talk very quickly about the transition that takes place from the public switch to IP. It's worth looking that while residential, where consumer users have the number of circuit switch lines have sort of dropped in half if you go from 2002 to the projection in 2004, business users have not moved quite so quickly. Now, some of the transition that took place on the residential side is frankly homes that dropped that second line that they used for dial-up, and of course some of it as well is the transition to mobile phone. However, businesses are not moving quite so quickly, and they remain a significant part of that public switch network. Moving on, just this is kind of access technology. Again, the final mile still continues to rely very heavily with copper. Now, obviously, there's still possible to use DSL and other technologies, but we need to be, how shall I say, careful not to overstate the the speed at which the transition is taking place. This is another way of looking at the uptake, comparing both business and the residential service for taking VoIP. One of the couple issues I want to talk about, we kind of, the earlier panelists talked about that in a hybrid network using VoIP, TTY can have some implementation issues. While it can be done, there are some challenges that take place in that environment that can be worked around, that need to be addressed, and which can be a barrier to that transition. People who kind of struggle with that. I'm losing the issue at the top. I wanted to kind of focus on the burglar alarm system. Yeah, there you see the burglar alarm system. Clearly, this is a central component to the public safety network. Burglar alarms, however, have only implemented a standard for VoIP in 2007. So in the sort of long tail phenomena of these systems that are already in place, it's worth recognizing that it's only since 2007, it's only been 4 years that this transition has begun to be made. The same is true with fire alarms. In fact, they're the standard that allows for a VoIP connection was set in 2010. So again, you have some implementation challenges for important components to the network that those services, those stranded services. Just by way of recognition, those kind of long tail effect of technology, as much as Matt and my companies would love to have folks make the transition to the newest and latest technology as quickly as possible, the reality is that technologies have a tendency to stay in place as long as they're useful to people. And I think Paul talked about some of the issues of if people are comfortable about something that's working for them at the present time, the change to some new system is a little harder to take. The example that I'm sort of citing here is with a standards issue that was of the 19th century, and yet it was only in 2007 that the last of that particular current made a transition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Turn it over to Norm. He's our go-to guy here at the FCC on disability technical issues.
Sure, and I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll be sharing as well. Hello, everyone. Bordeaux is a protocol that is used for communication between TTY devices, which is a legacy technology which is still in use today. TTYs use the Bordeaux protocol over single-line voice telephone to communicate with TTY-based captioning or text display. It includes voice, text, and amplifiers. And there's a recent report that shows that 12% of all relay calls are made through TTYs, which is a drastic reduction as we see the popularity of video relay services growing, but we're not seeing the death of the TTY. Bordeaux transmission over VoIP presents some interesting challenges. The error rate for VoIP is more sensitive with the Bordeaux protocol compared with voice transmission. One incorrect bit will cause other bits to cascade and therefore cause more serious errors. Packet loss can also cause some serious garbling in the Bordeaux protocol. There's no autocorrect for the Bordeaux protocol tones. If there's too much compression at use inside the VoIP codec, it can cause the Bordeaux tones to become garbled and the information can be incorrect. If we're also using 64 kilobits per second and we are looking at the 1AA codec that will preserve Bordeaux well, but many companies are using other more compressed standards for their VoIP transmission. Echo cancellation can also null those valid tones. There can be a delay between packets, which is known as a jitter. And similar to modem tones, we can see some errors that will cause those tones not to work. There's no way for a TTY to be recognized before the transmission. For example, fax machines that use a handshake technology in order to make sure that and they are communicating directly with another fax machine. There are two options that we can move forward with. One is to provide new SIP or SIP-based technology for users. We could also provide an analog adapter and ATA for those who are using TTYs in their homes. ATA would be good for those who want to keep their legacy equipment because it may be expensive to purchase new equipment, or because, as we've talked about, people are used to their equipment and want to keep it. The IP-based terminals would be good for those who are interested in upgrading their technology. VoIP services are needed too. We use those for voice calls, of course, but we would need one centralized TTY-friendly VoIP provider in order for this system to work, who can translate between the real-time text and the Bordeaux protocol, while still preserving the quality of the sound and using tuning technology to route appropriately for a TTY. It should be offered to TTY users for free so that deaf users of TTY can reach various centers with their call while still keeping their costs low. Not only for TTY, but real-time text to real-time text as well for pure IP environments. A similar protocol will be needed. Until all TTY users have transitioned to IP, we cannot drop the POTS system. So I think this is a good transition plan from the old technology into the new system. With 18 seconds left, I think I did pretty good.
Thanks, Norm. Moving on down the line.
Hello? Okay, good. Thanks, Chief Leibach, for inviting me here today. One thing I did want to mention before we got into the comments, my comments, were a little bit further background on that story about our adventures in Atlanta. I'd actually downloaded an app in anticipation of going to this TDI conference because I knew that I wasn't fluent in ASL. So I downloaded this app to, help me communicate with the individuals who were there, and I never got a chance to use it. But when we got to the airport in Atlanta, they had audibly announced a gate change. And anyone who's been in Atlanta during the summer travel season knows it can be a bit chaotic. And I realized that you probably didn't know that. So I was a little excited about my opportunity to use this app. So I walked over to you, handed you the phone with a little typed out message, and you waved me away as if I was some crazy man. Did not quite understand what it was. But we built some trust, and we got to the gate, and we got back to where we were going. And I think it's a little emblematic of the transition to IP, because as we've heard on this panel, it's going to be difficult for persons with disabilities, and CTIA and our member companies clearly believe that we need to carefully plan for this transition and make sure that everyone feels comfortable and is secure in their transition away from those technologies that they've known for such a long time. The transition to IP is really going to be a sea change for persons with disabilities. I mean, we're talking about moving from a technology where the user had to adapt to the limited technology of a telephone system to a technology that adapts for them, whether it's voice or text or video. And nowhere is this truer, as we've heard already, in TTYs. And TTYs traditionally were, required for text-based communications for persons with hearing or speech disabilities to be able to use the voice types of communications on a telephone network. And this approach was also transferred to the wireless industry when those services only supported voice. However, as we've heard, the actual use of TTY on wireless is incredibly limited because of a number of factors. One of them is mobility. Lugging around a clunky TTY device with a wireless handset is just impractical. At the same time, now we have text-based communication services that are far superior. SMS, email, instant messaging, all of these services that may not be exactly equivalent to TTY, but are leveling the playing field for persons with disabilities to be able to communicate in the exact same way through the same text-based communication systems as everybody else. However, the FCC's rules actually still require that wireless handsets support TTY, and especially with the new Accessibility Act rules, which actually recognize that electronic messaging, SMS and email, text messaging needs to be accessible, the utility of having TTY compatibility on wireless handsets is greatly diminished. This isn't to say, as Norm suggested, that we should get rid of TTY. There are going to be people who need it, particularly the deaf-blind community, who are going to rely on it in the wireline context. But in the wireless context, this rule just doesn't make much sense. So how are we going to address these issues? I think a couple things. First, spectrum and infrastructure. As the chairman mentioned, we need spectrum to speed the transition to IP. With more spectrum, wireless service providers will be able to handle increased traffic due to the transition. And there are already being standards put in place to manage IP-based communications to be as secure and reliable as voice communications are in the wireline context. And education is a key component, as Jennifer mentioned. And at every opportunity, we should really be encouraging those programs to make sure that persons with disabilities and senior citizens are comfortable with this transition to IP. So the faster we can address these issues, I think the faster the transition will come, and hopefully we'll meet the deadline that the text set out. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you guys all broke a record, so thank you for your excellent presentations, to the point that, I had a couple of questions. My list has now gotten smaller because you covered a lot of things that I was going to ask. Several of you discussed, well, really kind of two parts, identifying certain functions and features that are not available in the IP network but are on the PSTN and are used, and because of the fact that they're not available on the IP network, there's some individuals who are holding back and not yet willing to make that transition to the IP world. If you're talking about functions and features available in the IP world, really that would be a huge draw for people with disabilities. If you could point out to them, what they've been used to is also available to them in the IP world. I think it would actually draw folks over to IP based technology. Would you agree with that, or any discussion on that?
This is Norman. I could speak for TTY users. Making a TTY phone call over a voice line, you can watch the light to determine what's going on the other side. You can determine if someone has picked up the phone on the other side and is trying to speak. You can determine that someone's trying to communicate with you even if they aren't using a TTY on the other line. So if I make a phone call and get someone directly with a voice phone, and you get a child on the other line who picks up the phone and doesn't know to set it on the TTY. So if we're using IP-based technologies, we might not get the same type of indications. The typing may be fine, and once you start typing with someone, you have that conversation start and get that feedback. But for deaf users, that I know is one feature that would be considered missing in an IP-based system. But other than that, I can't think of anything.
Anyone else want to pick? Matthew?
Sure. I completely agree. I think, and Norm's pointing out that there are certain features that may not be available in the IP-based world, but the overall sum of the types of technologies that will be available for persons with disabilities in the IP-based far exceeds what is available in the PSTN world today. I think a lot of it's going to be education, making sure that, again, people are comfortable with this new technology, understand not only its limitations, but its power, and its ability to sort of flex to what their needs are. But ultimately, it's going to take some time and careful planning, particularly for these communities that have been relying and trusting of this other system in the past.
Greg, I have a comment. Yeah, I just don't think it's clear to our community what we would be gaining and what we might be losing. And I think there needs to be a better analysis of exactly what those features and functions might be. Some sort of research that sort of digs in a little bit more. I'm sort of concerned that some of the stuff that I've lost on my landline, for instance, I used to have free weather access, is now something that I can't get anymore. That's just one information service. I know I can get it other ways, and I imagine I can pay for it through some of the other networks. So I think there's some real issues around what I have been used to get and what would be different when the IP comes all the way to my house, and whether do I have to pay for those. This is, I think, a real concern in our community. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the disability community of any population group, and so any new cost on any phone service is a real question about loss when we have a transition. So until we're really clear about that, what we're losing, what we're not getting, even though there's wonderful new things we might be getting, we might have much better access to like tracking of our calls, for instance, or caller ID or whatever. I think we need to investigate, do some more research on this.
I think that Paul Schrader with AFB, get the microphone. I think just, there's this sense that just because we've always had something, we always should have it. And I get that there are changes that have to be made and will be made in terms of policy. And so, it isn't necessarily a I suppose if I were on a Republican debate, there wouldn't be a constitutional right to the PSTN or something, and so maybe that's a good debate. But I do worry about the fact that when people are in a mode, well, two things. One is that for people with disabilities who have grown up with or have had a substantial amount of time with their disability, this is an enormously adaptive community. This is a community that really is able to tackle new challenges. And I think one need only think back to prior to, 3 years ago, a number of us in the visually impaired community couldn't imagine how people would use an iPhone successfully. We could imagine a way that you could probably do it, and then all of a sudden you can't go into a group of blind people now and not find 90% of them carrying around an iPhone. No, that's not a real stat, but I mean a high number of them carrying around an iPhone and using the touch screen very successfully. So this is a highly adaptive group. But that, of course, is not the profile of most people who acquire a disability through aging. And I'm not saying that people who are aging can't make adjustments. They obviously can, they obviously do. But I do worry that what is absolutely wonderful about the way our PSTN has evolved into a very robust, very reliable, and also very simple to use structure is lost. And for people who simply want to remain connected and want to have easy access in case of an emergency without having to fiddle around with, is my phone on? How do I know if it's on? It takes me 2 minutes to figure out whether the darn wireless phone is coming on because there's no indication, I can't see the screen, that it's actually turning on. That'd be great if, it would become generally required that a phone would vibrate a little or do something to tell me that, yeah, it's actually getting power. Now, some will. Waiting 2 minutes to figure out only that my phone actually didn't turn on when I hit the switch, I have to do it again, and there's a burglar in my house, it's just not a really successful way to handle an emergency setting. So until we've got better requirements in place to ensure that the responsiveness of new technologies is as reliable as what we have in the PSTN, and the controls are as reliable and as straightforward to use as the push-button system that we've evolved in the PSTN. I do worry that we're losing something significant for people who either are unable or find it difficult to make the adjustment, or who are in crisis mode and simply don't have the time to fiddle about trying to figure out whether this newfangled piece of technology, which yes does lots of cool stuff, is actually going to work for the simple thing that I need to do right now, which is to reach out either to an emergency or to my friend to find out what's going on.
I think Paul put his finger on a key point for all technology adoption, which is that the things that our folks are familiar with and provide benefit in the current usage, they would just as soon stay with. And so the challenge that technology companies have is providing a sufficiently greater benefit that people want to learn and make that transition. And that's a phenomena that's not true just with the disabled, but is true with users across the board, that there's got to be that benefit process that people are willing to take the time to buy something new. Obviously, that's the challenge of our industries, is to make that and to have that happen at a rapid clip.
From the government perspective, the transition itself could be really years, including a decade. As far as the individuals, however, making the decision to transition, it can be a matter of an hour or 2 hours or so to go from the PSTN to IP-based technology. It really just depends on what will meet that individual's needs, what will be convenient for them, what will be accessible. Once all of those components are there, they'll very quickly, immediately, if you will, make that transition. So should it be a policy goal to either find ways to find substitutes, if you will, in the IP-based technology world, features and functions, that can be a substitute for what's on the PSTN, or should it be a goal to ensure that the new IP-based technology is backwards compatible with existing equipment and devices that are currently being used and relied upon with the PSTN network, such as, just an example, a TTY. So which do you think the policy goal should be? Just your 2 cents. And then secondly, obviously outreach will play a very major role in any transition. Once an individual decides to go IP-based, they'll do it for various reasons, but what would be the most effective outreach approach for those individuals once they make that decision?
I can speak to that. I think there are two different groups out there. One is the traditionalists who don't want to embrace change, don't want a new technology, or who are concerned about the expense. Why buy a new one when I have my old one? There's a second group who is the early adopters, the people who are interested in getting the newest thing, and we need to make sure that we support both of those people throughout the transition period. We can market to those who want the new technology and transition them over to IP-based technology. And maybe we have PSTN on the back end, on the other end, and VoIP for TTY services, for example. The traditionalists who may want to use the RJ11 jack, they don't care how it works, it just needs to look like an RJ11 jack, and it needs to click when you put it in the wall like an RJ11 jack does. As long as we can adapt to them to serve their needs so that we don't change that routine, we may get to transition them, but eventually we're going to have to move away from that. But I don't think that the approaches are the same for those two groups. I think they have different needs. And we'll need to support both of them throughout the transition.
This is Jennifer. I really don't have a good answer. I'm just thinking about my elderly mom and how when we transitioned her to using a cell phone, she really didn't understand how to use it, but we did find one that had, pseudo dial tone in it. So that made it more usable for her. So I think this is about usability, and if we are transitioning, we need to maybe mimic some things that look like the old stuff. But obviously, hopefully, there's enough incentive with the new things that people would want to do this. I don't think anybody's going to go out there and say, oh, today I'm going to switch my whole system over to IP. I think it's just not going to work that way. It's going to be based on the relevance of what the new stuff is going to do for the consumer, particularly consumers with disabilities. I mean, we've mentioned the cost issues a couple of times here, and I really want to kind of harp on it, because even a dollar more on a bill changes the finances for some people. The current bundling is an issue. I mean, maybe if these things could be thought about more from that perspective, I think companies are going to have to the carriers are going to have to do some education work around this one to really find the sweet spots that really work in our community. And that requires a little bit more market research with us.
Yeah, I tend to think we're going to see this happen. This move to other forms of network connectivity. So not through the PSTN, not so much through the traditional copper structure. And so, I don't sense that there's going to be a way. I mean, yes, there are ways to slow that down, but I think that's going to happen. So what I would want to see, the affordability issue, and I think the Commission's wrestling with that in a number of contexts, but two, the accessibility, and that we get clearer on what the expectations are for those issues around user interface and responsiveness and things of that sort, so that the technology industry that is serving these new networks is quite clear on what the expectations are, so that accessibility is something that is very well understood and very clear, and that consumers have an option for an interface that is reliable and responsive in a way that they can understand as it relates to their particular disability.
So I think there are a number of examples in history of modifications to infrastructure where we move from one technology to the other. And there's always going to be some sort of transition period and some reluctance to move to sort of that newer model. And I think you're seeing a lot of that here in this discussion, but particularly for persons with disabilities, the concern is probably more on something that this is a communications tool. This isn't just, a new road or, something else like that. This is actually, in some cases, their lifeline. So I think the concern there is valid, but needs to be addressed through education and, again, careful planning. But these are things that, historically we've addressed, and I think we will as well.
All good points. Transition doesn't necessarily mean you have to 100% give up what you have with the PSTN. You don't just quickly overnight give up everything. I know Paul had mentioned a success story about how the blind community very quickly adopted the use of whether it was the iPhone or the iPad once it became accessible. Paul, can you elaborate just a little bit on kind of how that uptake occurred, and could it be an example for other types of functions or features used by other folks with disabilities to meet their needs?
Well, I think a lot of people have talked about how successful the innovation that Apple brought to the iPhone and then iPad with the voiceover and the change in the design of the way one uses the touchscreen with voiceover and it is quite elegant. I think there are some lessons here. I mean, number one is just one more opportunity to compliment Apple for its great innovative design, and it is. It's really slick and elegant, and something that I think a lot of us were very pleasantly surprised about. But I think the other reality is that the iPhone doesn't work for everybody, and there is a substantial number of people with vision loss who either don't want or have taken an opportunity to examine the iPhone and have found that they don't want that kind of approach. They don't want to use a touch screen. I said earlier that we did a survey and found that people were still very interested in tactile keys they could feel, tactily discernible keys, which is a requirement in Section 255 for telephony and telephone access. And so will that change over time? I think it will. Do people who resist a touch screen become comfortable with it as they use something like the iPhone, and we're now seeing this with Android as well? Sure, and I don't know that we've done enough studies, or any studies really, to tell you what helps make that transition possible. I think a lot of it is, again, for people who have had vision loss long enough that they've learned how to make adaptations to their environment. We simply learn how to use the touchscreen just the way we learn other environments that weren't necessarily created for our convenience. And now the design of voiceover and touchscreens have become something that I expect we're going to see a lot of other use of those kinds of gesture-driven implementations in other touchscreen environments. But I do think there's still a substantial, as I said, a substantial number of people who don't want that interface, don't trust that interface, don't trust themselves to be able to control that interface. Will it change? Is there a way to speed that and to help people with that? Sure. Training is a key part of that. But I think at bottom there is still just a basic user comfort level that some people just won't get around that, don't want to go around that curve, and want to choose a different option. I'll just say for myself, I have an iPhone and I have a cell phone with a keypad, a tactile keypad. I have two phones, and I can tell you that when it comes to quickly dialing a number, I much prefer my tactile keypad. Sorry, Apple. But that's just the truth. But for me, and I haven't made, I do use the touchscreen for phone dialing and all the other aspects of it. But when it comes to trying to do a quick text message or dial a phone, I'm much happier having the tactile keypad in an interface that I can easily and quickly use. And I think there's probably still a number of people, and particularly older people, who are going to fall into that category.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone in the audience has any questions for our distinguished panelists. Anyone? Seeing no one. Norm, I know Norm had a point that he wanted to raise, so I'm going to turn it back to him for a second.
Yes, just one additional point about the transition to IP from PSTN and potential losses for the deaf community in particular. Light alerts, so currently with PSTN-based equipment such as TTYs, the RJ11 can ring a light. So house-wide, the entire house full of lights can flash when this TTY rings. When we replace this with an IP-based technology, we did not think about how the IP communication can interface with these lights in our homes in order to signal us that someone is calling us. So we may require a standard interface for alerts that are house-wide. At the moment, RJ11 is still the best interface for deaf folks in terms of getting alerts when we have phone calls. Should we develop a new system, or should we continue to use the RJ11 system? That's a question that is up for debate.
Thank you very much, and it's a good point. I have a final question before we wrap up this panel. Right now, what rate of innovation are you seeing in the area of disability access solutions for IP-based technology? What have you guys observed so far, and what do you think will be coming down the pipe?
Video-related technologies are moving at light speed. Bandwidth is constantly improving, and we're taking advantage of that for communicating with each other, and that's the technology that I see that is growing by leaps and bounds, and it allows us to communicate over sign language, video, even on mobile devices for deaf people.
This is Jennifer again. Excuse me. I think consumers do see this as fast moving, and I think that becomes a concern in some cases, that they feel that they can't understand it, can't catch up with it, don't really know what's going on. So I just want to emphasize the point about consumer education by the service providers and the device manufacturers, as well as by the Federal Communications Commission on these things. I mean, fact sheets to explain what this is about would be highly useful. You know, the switch from PSTN to IP. I mean, what does that really mean for the average consumer and for consumers with disabilities? I mean, things like that could be enormously helpful to get the word out through the key organizations that work with people with disabilities.
So, particularly in the mobile space, I mean, you're seeing an era of unparalleled innovation. I mean, it's really incredible what's going on. But I think one of the things that's really going to spur people, particularly individuals with disabilities, onto IP-based technology is the adoption by their friends and family and the people that they communicate with. So the more that they're adopting, the more that they're going to want to move on to those types of technologies and benefit from them. So this is going to change quickly, and as Jennifer noted, there's going to be a need for some education for certain, particularly non-adopting communities.
I think it's this is Paul Schrader. I think it's probably mixed. I mean, for sure, solutions are moving very rapidly, and nowhere more quickly than in the development of apps for a number of mobile technologies and a number of people moving to IP-based communication as well. The concern I do have is that twofold. One is that speed outstrips the ability that we have in the consumer community, I think, to be able to evaluate and provide information. That's a problem in the sense that we're not able to give consumers with disabilities good information about what's accessible, what's not. Obviously, we haven't seen the implementation of the Communications and Video Accessibility Act soon enough to know what that's going to do for advanced communications. We'll see. Hopefully that will make the right kinds of changes as industry has its time to implement those changes in the generous time frame given by the Commission to do that. The second thing is as others have pointed out, I think Jennifer pointed out, the complexity, while allowing for a lot of these great changes, is certainly a concern to a number of people, and we've said that over and over again. So I don't, there are ways in which we can address that, certainly through better and clearer accessibility requirements that address that topic and ensure that people are not having to struggle just to be able to make use of a feature which perhaps is technically accessible but not really very usable because of the challenges one has to go through with a disability to gain access to it. So I think some of that we'll work through as over the next few years as we begin to implement access to advanced communication services. That will help, I think, hasten transition toward mobile technologies for people with disabilities. But I do think, for the most part, industry looks for opportunities to work with the disability community on that, and we the same with industry. But these things move at such quick speed. Just a quick example: the number of apps that are offered that are initially accessible and then are changed, altered, and in a new version, and then some of the accessibility gets lost. We're beginning to see that, and we're beginning to get very concerned about that. And it's hard pressed. We're hard pressed to figure out where to attack that problem. So it's not really the topic of today's conversation, but it does suggest why this environment is of some concern to those of us in the disability community who fear that we're not able to help our consumers keep up with these changes, and in some instances the changes may in fact be eroding accessibility.
Thanks, Paul. All right, we have run out of time for this panel. I do believe it's worth mentioning that the FCC has its clearinghouse now. It's part of the accessibility, innovation initiative program. So we are maintaining a clearinghouse to help identify specifically mobile devices with various accessibility features. It was launched just this past October, and we're obviously continuing to make some tweaks to it and improving it, but I think that site might be helpful to help point out various devices that folks have found to be accessible. Thank you for your contributions and your continued help in this ongoing process. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. We're just going to move right on to the next panel, trying to keep trains on schedule. The next panel is the technical capacity, capabilities, and challenges facing future rural networks. It's going to be co-moderated by Commissioner Ann Boyle from the Nebraska Commission and Jim Schlichting from the Wireless Bureau at the FCC, and I'll let them introduce the panelists and take it from there. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Jim Schlichting, Senior Deputy Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. And as Lisa mentioned, co-moderating the panel is Commissioner Boyle, from a longtime member of the Nebraska Public Service Commission. This panel is focused in the broader topic of the challenges of transition from the public switch telephone network on the particular set of issues that are raised in the context of rural networks. This is a charge that the Technological Advisory Council is considering. They have the luxury that at least staff at the FCC frequently don't have, of taking a step back and focusing on some of the longer term issues involving the country's telecommunications network. And that's one of the advantages and one of the things that we're looking forward out of today's panel, and that is the ability to get input from folks outside the commission with regard to some of the opportunities and challenges over the course of the coming years with regard to transition of the networks in rural areas. So I want to introduce the first three members of the panel, and Commissioner Boyle is going to introduce the final three members, and then we'll take it from there. Starting immediately to my left is Erwin Hudson, who's the Chief Technology Officer from Wild Blue Communications, which is a wholly owned division of Viasat Corporation. To his left is Stephen Berry, who is President and CEO of the Rural Cellular Association. To his left is Jack Unger, who is on the board of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA, and is also the FCC committee chair of WISPA.
Thank you, Jim.
It will be. We'll turn it on as you speak, I think.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. The other three people who are going to be serving on this panel. I have to say first that Mr. Unger has the most colorful description. He is the grandfather of the wireless internet service industry, internet service provider industry. So that is something to be had. The other three people who are going to be part of this is Larry Thompson, who is the CEO of Vantage Point Solutions, Tom Simmons of Mid-Continent Communications. He is a Senior Vice President of Public Policy. And John T. McHugh with Opasco, who I will just say this. Oftentimes I will come into a room and I will say, "What's new?" With John, I said, "Are you keeping out of trouble?" He said, "No," and then I said, "What's new?" So with that, we'll start with our first panelist. That would be Mr. Hudson.
Thank you.
All right.
So, thank you.
The topic of satellite has been mentioned, a few times during the panel, and I think the satellite technologies that are currently in place, some of the legacy technologies do suffer from some technical limitations, and I think a lot of the concerns and issues people have with satellite technology are based on historical and legacy systems that probably aren't truly applicable to next generation systems. We launched our next generation satellite just a few weeks ago at the end of October. This is a whole new approach to satellite broadband. Nothing like this has ever been done before. The satellite had a very successful launch. It's currently in stationary orbit. It's located at its permanent operating position. We're about 80% finished with testing it, and we expect to have it in service at the end of December, early January. And some of the things the satellite can do is that our base service offering is going to be a 12 megabit broadband plan. It'll be 12 megabits down and 3 to 5 megabits up, and it'll be available in most of the United States, including all of Hawaii and a good fraction of Alaska. And we're going to offer this base service for about $50 a month, which we think is incredibly compelling compared to what's been in the market in the past. I think that for a reasonably large fraction of Americans, the fastest, most cost-effective service available to them, regardless of whether they're in the most rural areas or not, may very well be this new WildBlue broadband service. It is truly transformational technology. It's got incredibly fast web surfing speeds, approaching fiber-like performance for surfing the web. The web's not terribly speed dependent. It's much more latency and kind of object-oriented dependent. It does very good audio streaming, video streaming, video conferencing, and it's just a highly reliable IP service. The question about satellite VoIP and voice always comes up, and today the U.S. government does subsidize satellite voice under the USF when it's selected by the rural telcos as an alternative to a wired service. We believe that wireless technologies, including satellite, are really a good alternative to legacy wireline voice. The VoIP services over the new satellite technologies work extremely well. I think most people that make a call over our new network are quite surprised by how good it is. And we think that these new technologies, with very fast speeds, the ability to watch HD TV on large screen sets, is something that the rural market has been waiting for. We're very excited to offer it, and we think it'll make a huge difference in what's available to the unserved and underserved areas of the United States.
Mr. Berry?
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, Commissioner Bowles and Jim. Appreciate it. What you need? Oh, you need this? No, I have no slides to share with you. I thought I'd just focus on one of the major policy issues that are a great concern to us. It's actually the central tenet of telecommunications regulatory policy, and it has been for over a century. And for us, it's basic interconnections. And RCA is a strong supporter of competitive connectivity and the competitive connectivity agenda. And maintaining an open public switch telephone network is an essential part of that mission. And regardless of the technology, a robust competition requires non-discriminatory interconnection among and between and among carriers. And like I said, regardless of technology, in the wireless arena, this is going to mean assurance of voice and data roaming for interoperable devices. And all these policies are interrelated, we believe, and a threat of a policy change that would, in the conversion from a public switch telephone network, the PSTN, would jeopardize competition and benefits that we've enjoyed for literally decades. And in fact, we are glad to see that in the broadband plan, the FCC recognized that this basic interconnection is a responsibility. The FCC developed this policy decades ago. The Congress reaffirmed that policy in 1996 and Section 251 of the Communication Acts. in the Communication Act. And if you will bear with me just a second, I'll give you the sort of the rationale for why we believe that this is sort of the underpinning tenet that it is of great concern to us as we transition from PSTN to an IP protocol. FCC is taking great pains to confirm that even wholesale carriers must be able to interconnect pursuant to Section 251. And the VoIP providers should be able to exchange their traffic on the PSTN through a wholesale provider. I note that VoIP providers under current law do not have this right, but under a wholesale provider or other network provider, they have been confirmed so. So the next logical step to focus on, I believe, is to clarify the FCC, as well as all of us in the room, to clarify that the interconnection rights established under Section 251 apply fully with respect to the traffic exchange in an IP format. And the IP format of an incumbent LEC currently, though, must be converted, the traffic must be converted to TDM if it originated in an IP format before it's handed off to the ILEC. And this, we believe, serves no particular useful purpose. It is a mandate that should be a technology neutral, and it should be constructed in a different format in the IP world if you're going to maintain competitive policy. So Section 251, 251A, we believe requires that telecommunication carriers interconnect with their networks directly or indirectly, and there's no reference in that to particular technology. And 251B5B likewise requires reciprocal compensation agreements. Again, no particular definition as assigned to IP or non-IP, because interconnected VoIP traffic is already established by the FCC to be telecommunications traffic. And 251CB2 requires incumbent LECs to interconnect with requesting carriers at any technical and feasible point. Again, without a technology-based limitations applied. So the equal treatment in an IP world and a PSTN world of connectivity is going to be an important element that we have to continue to encourage, and policy should and continue to sustain. In short, the PSTN, as we know it, was probably going to go away. I think the chairman's numbers were a little low. I think it's over 24% of all traffic now is VoIP, and the future is coming faster than we may otherwise think. So it's extremely important that we update our IP connected policies. I'm very concerned that some may view this as an opportunity with the interconnection rights in the IP world to essentially eliminate competition, i.e. create a private information-based technology network, and therefore refuse to connect with other competitive providers. I think this would be an era of great significance and proportions to our economic well-being, and I think that's one of the main issues that we have to focus on and ensure that we do not allow the underlying concept of basic connectivity to be deteriorated. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. There we go.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you again, Steve. Jack, I think it's your turn up at bat.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And I've got some slides here. Let's see if we can put those up. Okay. And let's get this clicker to click. There we go. Okay. I want to start off by thanking the FCC for this workshop and for inviting WISPA to participate in it. Delivering broadband, especially to those who are unserved or underserved, has always been WISPA's goal. Today, we estimate about 3 million people in the U.S. are getting their broadband from WISPs, and these are folks who have no other existing option for getting broadband at home. So in many areas, WISPs are the only broadband providers. For example, in Texas, if you can see this map, the pink areas are the areas that are served only by WISPs. No cable, no DSL. In Illinois, the purple areas here are the areas served only by WISPs. In Colorado, so we feel that those WISPs, the 2,500 or so of them in the U.S., are the real American heroes who are delivering broadband today and have been actually since 1994. WISPs have been deploying IP-based fixed wireless broadband networks since 1994 in this country and more now around the world. I want to just take a moment and compare fixed wireless with mobile wireless. We all hear the term wireless, we think of our cell phone. Fixed wireless broadband is distinctly different than mobile broadband. Let's look at the terms in terms of quantity of broadband delivered. Mobile plans typically 3 to 5 gigabytes a month. Fixed wireless broadband plans typically deliver from 30 to 100 gigabytes of throughput per month. So do the math. For about the same price, fixed wireless delivers about 10 times more data. Or said another way, fixed wireless delivers broadband for one-tenth the cost of mobile. And typically the fixed broadband is of somewhat higher quality. So in my mind, it's unlikely that mobile broadband is ever going to approach fixed wireless broadband, or fixed wired infrastructure for that matter, with regard to cost and quality. Also, the market served, fixed serves people at home. This cellular, mobile, serves us on the move. So we have two distinct markets. Let's keep them clear in our minds, keep them apart. Reliability with fixed is typically very high, with mobile, somewhat less. Latency, with fixed, it's well under 100 milliseconds, typically 20 milliseconds. With mobile, it's higher. Okay, this is a slide. I'm sorry I had them out of order. This is the slide that shows you the 10-to-1 cost advantage of fixed over mobile. VoIP over wireless, VoIP over fixed wireless is clearly a reality. VoIP can be overlain on any fixed wireless broadband network. Best VoIP results are achieved when there is QoS enabled on the wireless network, as most of them do today. VoIP costs. VoIP is typically delivered over fixed wireless broadband today for $20 to $30 a month. The real reason why everyone in the U.S. does not have broadband today at home is because of the cost of the backhaul. We estimate that 15% of the people in this country have no broadband at home today. That's 48 million people. It's a lot of people who are not part of the broadband age. And the reason is delivering backhaul to the rural areas costs 400 to 800 times as much as getting backhaul in a large city. In the city, we can buy backhaul for $1 per megabit typically. In the rural areas, $400 to $800 per megabit. So meeting the challenge of getting backhaul out through the middle mile to our local communities is the one challenge that when we meet that successfully, everyone in this country will enjoy broadband at home. So the questions that hopefully we'll give some thought to today: will the Connect America Fund, as it funds backhaul, will that truly be open? Will it be open and accessible to the community-based ISPs who are trying to bring broadband to everyone? Will the middle mile needs highlighted by the National Broadband Plan truly be met in an open fashion? Okay, I see the time is very short. and to bring backhaul out there with wireless.
Your time is up.
Okay, thanks, folks. Again, want to thank the FCC for all the work they're doing.
Larry Thompson, who is next with Vantage Point.
All right, thank you. Vantage Point Solutions provides engineering and consulting services to about 250 of the 1,000 or so small ILECs throughout the United States that serve the most rural regions of our country. You know, the rural telecom providers, they have unique challenges that a lot of the other providers don't have. We've assisted quite a few of these with this migration from the narrowband PSTN network to an IP broadband network, and so we understand the rural. Before this rural transition, or the transition to an IP network can take place, it's necessary that the network be in place end to end. No one believes that this IP network would work if we have our narrowband POTS network still in place in some areas of the country. And so it needs to be end-to-end, and to be successful, that network needs to have adequate capacity, speed, and quality to be able to meet the customer's demands, and that's the real big challenge here. In a relatively short amount of time, you know, these broadband networks have become an integral part of our lives for many of us, and it's difficult to imagine a world nowadays without email and Facebook and online retailers and a lot of the things that we've come to take for granted. But today the focus is rural. I come from a town of about 15,000 people where, to many of you, that would be a rural community. That's not the type of community I'm talking about today when I say rural. There's thousands of towns with just a few hundred people scattered across the United States that serve, surrounded by areas that have maybe 10 people or even down to 1 person per square mile. It's a small percentage of our population, but it makes up a large percentage of our land mass. So the challenge of providing these IP networks in these areas are numerous and often are misunderstood. Due to limited access to retailers or to consumers or educational facilities, libraries, healthcare, and things like that, you could argue that it's these rural people that need these IP networks even more than the people that live in the urban areas. And migrating to an adequate IP network not only benefits those customers, but I believe it benefits the nation as a whole. To understand the challenges that the IP migration will have, we have to first understand the building blocks that make up these IP networks. If we break it down into 3 basic components, first of all, we have the middle mile. It's the connection between these providers and their urban areas that connect them to the internet. Oftentimes those distances are very large and it can be very expensive. Then you have the core network as the second component, which is the central brains of the organization. It's the routers and switches and things that connect the customer to the urban areas where they get the on-ramp to the internet. And then the last mile, or sometimes called the local loop, where it's just the connection between the providers, central offices or head ends to the customer. The local loop, or that last mile component, is by far the most expensive portion of these providers' network. Oftentimes is 60 to 70% of the total network investment is that local loop portion. Each of the types of providers, and we do wireless and wireline engineering, but each one has their own unique challenges. For the satellites, oftentimes it's latency. For the wireless provider, it's access to spectrum or terrain or things like that. For the landline, it could be the quality or the age of their cable plant. The rural providers have been migrating their networks to IP for a number of years, and the way they do that is pushing fiber deeper and deeper into their networks. I think we'd all have to agree that a fixed broadband network is probably the ultimate goal if we're talking about high-capacity broadband reliable networks. It not only increases the broadband capable to the end user, but also provides benefits to the provider in the form of reduced operational costs and greater long-term revenue potential. I'm not saying that a landline is necessarily better than a wireless connection. The reality is it's like wheels on a bicycle. I think you need both of them. Most consumers are going to want a landline connection for the high capacity broadband pipe it offers, and a wireless connection for the mobility and the lower speed broadband that it's going to provide for its services, for lower speed web browsing, maybe small screen video and things like that. But both wireless and wireline networks are migrating to a complete IP infrastructure. When it's complete, all services, including voice, are going to be delivered over that IP pipe. But when will it occur is the question. It won't happen like the cellular network or the analog TV networks where you flip a switch one day. It's going to be a gradual process.
I'm supposed to be the timekeeper.
Okay.
And we have limited time to ask questions, and so because of that, I apologize. I don't mean to sound rude.
Okay.
To keep us on time. So thank you. Tom Simmons is next with Mid-Continent Communications.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you for inviting me to this panel presentation. I also have some slides. And is there a clicker that goes along with that? Okay. It's not the most technological name, clicker, is it? At any rate, I am Tom Simmons with Mid-Continent Communications, a small regional cable company located in the upper portion of the country. I read a report one time that said we're from the rectangular or the uninhabited rectangular states of the north. But while our population is spread out, I think we are an important part of the country. Our company provides cable television services, data services, in a lot of cases telephone services to customers in give or take about 310 communities and about 250,000 customers. If you do the math, you'll recognize that most of our communities are very, very small, but very significant to us. Over the course of the last few years, we've worked very hard at building out our network to connect all of these communities to provide similar services regardless of the size of the towns. We built that on a fiber backbone that runs through our three-state area. That backbone has 100 gigabit capability today, looking for opportunities to grow beyond all of that. And what we've been able to do is provide data services into those communities at 100 megabits per service, which is pretty quick service, pretty good capacity, especially given the size of the communities. We've also been able to link our network in to a lot of other networks throughout the country, giving businesses in our part of the country connectivity to other places in the nation with data transport that doesn't necessarily hit or rely on the internet. Some of the very small communities that we have are, in fact, very small. I use, for an example, a very important town, Dunseith, North Dakota, which happens to be located just south of the international border. In fact, it's just down the road from the International Peace Gardens. It also is just down the road from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and it's a small town that's looking for opportunities to grow and develop and frankly, stay connected with the rest of the world. The demographic makeup of the community is that it has a population of 739 people, 253 households. That's 178 families. Over 70% are Native American. Unfortunately, 40% of the families below the poverty level. Nearly 50% of those under the age of 18 live in poverty. And one of the things the connectivity can do for communities like this is probably get them into the mainstream. And we've been working very hard with those communities and will continue to do so under a new plan that's been announced by the FCC in the Connect to Compete program that will give opportunities for low-income folks to be able to take advantage of all of the stuff that we've come to know and use with internet connectivity. Adoption is a very big part of the equation for us. In our part of our presentation, I had understood that we were looking for to answer a couple of important questions, one being the technical developments paving the way. For our industry, DOCSIS 3.0, the ability to bond channels has been a very important technological advancement to give us the capacity on our networks. Also, a number of cable companies are going through a digital transition. Several have, several will, in order to reclaim analog real estate in order to provide more advanced services, whether it be internet capacity or more high-definition channels on systems. I think the other things that have made a difference for us are increasing opportunities in backhaul with other providers. As was mentioned earlier, we look for those opportunities. I think the optical technologies have been getting much better to allow us on these high, long-distance networks to be able to provide a higher degree of capacity for both standard residential uses and also for economic development. There are also some technological impediments in the rural areas. One large one, of course, is just plain the distance involved, and of course the increasing demand on capacity, not only from companies looking to take advantage of that data transport, but also even in our residential customers taking advantage of more appliances, more devices, more applications that need that capacity. I think middle mile connectivity is going to be very important for us, and we're looking for opportunities also to push our network deeper into neighborhoods and closer to our customers by a technology called fiber deep, where we move our nodes deeper in and there are less numbers of people dependent upon that node. We expect more things to come as our industry looks for new ways to serve new customers.
Thank you so much for your comments. And lastly, John McHugh with OPASCO.
Thank you to the FCC for inviting me here today and having the opportunity to speak. I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to listen to me. No pictures to look at. And Commissioner Boyle, thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciated that. Anyway, first of all, OPASCO represents the companies that serve small rural areas in the United States. So when the topic of the panel was rural networks, I just want to make sure the remarks that I present here apply only to those small companies that OPASCO represents. There are an awful lot of rural territories in the United States that are served, underserved, or not served at all by others. Good opportunity for some folks. The transition that we're talking about and the fact that it's must have a date certain and we have to set timelines and so on, I don't think that's all really important at this point. I think the transition of technology is something natural. It occurs in an orderly fashion. It's been done for years. Obviously, we went from manual switching with operators plugging cords into a board to mechanical switching, in some cases to electronic switching, to digital switching, and now currently into the soft switch arena. Unfortunate to say I've worked on all of them. I think the companies that we represent have gone above and beyond the call to duty to provide their customers with the latest technologies. Most of our companies are deploying soft switches today. Most of our companies have some sort of a fiber to the home, fiber to the curb, or fiber to the premise deployment, either completed or underway. We're offering over 90% of our customer base some form of broadband technology. So I think this transition to IP-based broadband connectivity is well underway in the small rural companies that OPASCO represents. What also we've been able to accomplish, and I think it was alluded to a couple of times here about the cost of transport, the ability to bring services to rural America. And what most of the small companies have done is form partnerships, affiliations, consortiums, or whatever, to number one, build regional, statewide, or other fiber networks. There's a effort underway to connect all of these fiber networks so that it's a nationwide, independently owned fiber network. We've worked with others, third-party providers, to bring cloud services to our broadband consumers, either under a white label or under our own initiatives. We've worked with wireless providers, both large and small, to provide broadband wireless technologies to complement our wireline services. So all of the efforts to make this transition, a conversion to broadband and to bring advanced services to the ruralest of rural America are well underway with at least the companies that I work with. But there are concerns, and I think Mr. Thompson brought a lot of them up. And the concerns are, on the public safety panel, the next generation E911, what needs to be done. It's tough enough to provide a single route to an emergency service provider within rural America, but to provide diversity is extremely difficult. The consumer devices that were mentioned earlier that are not IP enabled must be made IP enabled in order to be used. The ability to convert consumers who don't want broadband, that we have to go out and actually bring the broadband to the prem and then put in a device that'll take their existing analog devices and convert them at that point, including voice capabilities. The challenge of building broadband to everybody and then having that end user go over the top and get their voice services from a third-party provider, not necessarily the voice provider of today. The ability to figure out how we're going to connect on an IP basis. It was brought up about IP interconnection earlier. I believe the FCC has that in their further notice of proposed rulemaking in the ICC USF order, and they seek comments on it. I think that's a great step forward to figure out how small rural IP clouds are going to be able to connect. One issue that is of importance, we're starting to see the transition and we're starting to see degradation of call flow. We currently have an issue in front of the Commission on call termination, and we firmly believe that some of that is because of the fact we have IP or SIP-controlled IP calls in the middle of a PSTN originated or PSTN call. So thank you very much. I'm finished.
Very good. Good job. All right, now we are open to questions. Any questions from the audience? Not quite yet, so I'm sure you... Did you have a question? No. So I'll see one of maybe only 7 or 8 women in the room, or who was the last time I counted. I'll ask a question, and that is, Mr. McHugh, you mentioned something about the technologies of tomorrow and technologies of today. The PSTN network has many applications, and they do just about everything. And I have some concerns, and you started to talk about that, regarding not only access to public safety, but also to some of the other things, like the people who use a little technique to, if they fall and can't get up.
Help me out falling, yes.
Yes. So, all of you, if you would take the time to answer satellite, cable, and everything, are you capable of providing all the services that the PSTN network does, and in the terms of public safety?
You want me to start that one
Sure.
off? The IP networks of the future currently have not offered the opportunities to replace all of the devices. And by the way, I sit on the TAC, and one of the big issues is exactly that. How do we address all of the concerns of alarm services, auto calls, auto dialers that are out there, all have to be replaced. And one, obviously, the most is the public safety issue of the, help, I've fallen down and I can't get up. If it relies on broadband connectivity, then the consumer at some point is going to have to be, well-versed in what that new device is when that new device is in fact developed. To my knowledge, I don't think it's out there yet.
Okay. Anybody else?
Tom Simmons from the cable folks. Our company has been providing telephony services for a long time. In fact, we provided in a circuit switched component over our cable plant with a conversion to the IP side. We're certificated in all of the states through the Public Utilities Commissions there. So under that certification, we basically have to provide absolutely everything that's provided on PSTN. We see a growing side of our business most recently getting into the alarm side. And it's raised some concerns in some of our communities regarding the rules and regulations as it pertains to fire codes, whether or not service on a VoIP network is in fact allowable under their provisions. Some of those provisions just changed in the last year, which has opened up opportunities for us to provide those circuits. But in a lot of cases, it's required some changes, even in some community ordinances, that would allow consideration of VoIP services for those purposes.
Anyone else?
I mentioned briefly the 3 different elements, the middle mile, the core network, and the local loop. You bring up a good point that there's a 4th element there, which is the customer premise equipment. And Mr. McHugh hit on that a little bit, where as we make this migration, a lot of the older equipment is compatible with the analog PSTN and not necessarily compatible with broadband IP networks, which means a swap out of a lot of customer premise equipment. And also, a lot of times along with that comes customer powering issues, because oftentimes the new broadband networks don't power the customer equipment as the old PSTN did.
Speaking for satellite, it's certain that we can't do all the old stuff in the old way, but I think that we can do most of the old objectives in new and better ways. In particular, we can support VoIP services and ATAs in the home, provide a basic phone service with a UPS, modest UPS. We can deal with power outages of several hours, not certainly several days, and we can provide mobile services for public safety and telemedicine with a very small antenna on the top of an ambulance or other vehicle. We can easily provide 10, 20 megabits of service, which would allow someone to do all kinds of medical procedures remotely that you couldn't possibly do today with today's technology.
Yeah, I think I would sort of second what Erwin was saying. And I mean, we heard earlier from Paul Schroeder that many of the new wireless apps are effective, useful, but they can't actually be delivered. We can't actually deliver an IP 911 call to a call center unless you convert it. Even under the FCC rules and regulations, you'd have to do so. So I like Derwin's ideas that we are going to be able to provide the traditional expected services in a new IP world, especially in a web-based world, but also the public safety requirements have to be looked at and have to be upgraded, and many of their networks will have to be modified in order to receive that solution.
Thank you, and all I can see is great big dollar signs for doing all that conversion. And of course, I know we have many resources for that. There's a question from the audience, and it is, although there is funding to support services for rural areas, how do we avoid creating a digital divide? Is it a technology issue or an end user adoption problem? And how do we solve this issue? Is it merely money?
And may I just briefly address that? From my perspective, it's a technology issue and an end user issue, but the technology has to be there available before and it could be an end user issue. So we've got to bring broadband to everyone first, then those who don't adopt it will have the option of using it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll address that too. I don't see any big technology advance on the horizon that's going to solve the problem that I talked about earlier when it comes to the costs associated with that local loop or the last mile piece. I think a lot of it is not so much technology related, but policy related. We need to be able to have a mechanism to be able to fund those places that can't afford broadband just based on end user revenues alone.
Okay. John McHugh.
Just briefly, when we say digital divide, I certainly think about the fact that there's consideration that the definition of broadband in rural America is 4 megs down and 1 up, yet in other parts of the country it's a lot higher than that. When I hear digital divide, that's where I think the issue is, that if we're saying rural America only deserves 4 meg and in urban America deserves 25 or 100, then we're certainly creating a digital divide because of a policy issue. So just to make clear, I think that rural Americans deserve just as much as anybody else in the country, and I think when we start talking about the ability to deliver that, now we're talking the real issue of cost. The technology is there. We can put the technology out without a problem. It's just the cost of doing so.
Another?
I believe with Larry that the issues that we have out there are issues. They're not going to go away. Distance is the major factor. We need more capacity in the middle mile components. And I get a little annoyed sometimes at the reference to the digital divide, as if rural areas don't have any digital services, nor do they have really an understanding of what to do with it, even if they had them. That is not true. In a lot of our communities with populations well below 500, we're delivering 100 megabits into those communities, and there are some very creative things going on in those communities as to what to do with it. We deliver the network with all that stuff, and even with the folks who may not have the money to be able to do a whole lot beyond all that. I mean, the folks who need the assistance, it's more than just access to the network. It's the computer and the understanding of what the applications really are and all those components of adoption. I don't think it's a matter of what do you do first, build out the particular networks, or is it an adoption issue? It's both, and we need to do that now. We need to put together effective programs for adoption in those areas that have access to those networks, learn to become efficient from all of that as we roll it out into other areas, and make sure that any of the funds that we use for capitalization in these areas, whether it's subsidies to build out, are in fact used for that purposes, as opposed to overbuild situations or less than efficient use of scarce dollars in order to get the job done in rural areas.
Let me, I'm more concerned about a fundamental policy issue that will, whether it's WISP replacing wireline providers or satellite replacing wireless or WISP, or I'm more concerned about this multimodal environment that we're moving into under an IP. The core of the PSTN is now digital, and the majority of it's digital. It's been digital for some time. I'm more concerned about the requirement to interconnect, a competitive interconnectivity agenda, and I think that is what's going to avoid having a digital divide. A requirement that the FCC could make clear now before we are in a situation where we're transitioning from a PSTN, that this concept that has served us well for 100 years, that basic telecommunications carriers, providers should interconnect with other providers and carriers. And I don't want to get into a situation where, because you declare yourself an all IP-based technology and therefore you're not a wireless telecommunication, you're not a telecommunications service, you're an information service, you don't have to connect with anyone. I think that is, in my opinion, is the most significant policy issue that has to be addressed and addressed now. I'm confident every one of these companies and guys sitting at the table will find technologies to preserve the consumer. I'm not as confident that they will be able to connect with each other and actually provide that ubiquitous coverage that we've enjoyed. And that's my main concern, is it's a policy decision that can be made now by the FCC and the states to ensure that requirement of connectivity, competitive connectivity at fair, reasonable, economically sustainable rates.
Okay, so as I understand it, Jim's going to ask the next question, but you're talking about a blend of services that all connects. Is that correct?
I'm talking about all services in an IP world, in a web-based world, having the ability to continue to connect. When you pick up a phone, you don't know if it's IP or analog, or you know that you want that phone call to go through, whether it's in Ohio or Illinois or California or Asia. You want it to be able to go through. And I think this is a fundamental policy decision that has to be confirmed now. I think I laid out what I thought was the statutory logic of why it is a requirement, and I don't think it is. It's a far stretch to lay it out. I think, but it does need to be clarified in the most unequivocal fashion now.
Thank you.
Actually, I did see that somebody from the audience, so if you'd identify yourself, that'd be really great.
Yeah, I'm Matt Warner from the Wireline Competition Bureau here at the FCC, and I just want to get to a data point brought up by the WISP organization. The 400 to 800 times number, was that based on a survey of your members, and what would you propose to sort of bring that cost down?
Yes. I don't think this mic is on. There we go. Yes, it's based on ongoing discussions among our members about how much they're paying for backhaul bandwidth in their rural communities. In a wire center in the middle of a city, it's $1 a megabit. Out in a rural area, it can be $500, $600, $700, $800 a megabit. So yes, that's real world data. How can we get that cost down? We need effective middle mile connectivity. If it's subsidized middle mile connectivity, then that should be open to all all service providers along that middle mile and at the far end.
Jack, don't put that microphone too far away, because I was going to ask you a couple of follow-on questions based on your presentation. First, in just terms of a factual basis, you had those maps indicating in those areas in those states that where you thought broadband was served only by WISP. I was sort of what the basis was for those maps and what you were comparing it to. I mean, with, you know, there's mobile wireless 3G services, 4G services. So whatever you can in terms of explaining what's on those maps, that'd be very helpful.
Oh, okay, Jim, thank you. The maps that you saw are based on National Broadband Plan data turned in by service providers all across the country in 2010. So the data is there would already be more color on those maps if it were updated to 2012. What was the next question?
Well, the question
how
of
does
whether
it
this
compare to
includes
satellite and
well,
how does,
the mobile wireless or satellite.
Yes. Okay. We didn't include satellite on there because current satellite technology is not really at the same level as the broadband, fixed wireless broadband, or fixed wired broadband. Erwin's presentation was interesting about the new generation of satellite technology that will change that picture substantially, but it's not right here today with us yet. As far as mobile, again, the difference between mobile broadband and fixed broadband, it should be pretty clear by now. At home, it's fixed broadband. If you operate or work from home, you're not going to typically use your cell phone to connect to the internet and do all your work that way. So mobile coverage is not shown on there because it's serving a separate market, the mobile market, rather than the fixed market. However, typically in the rural areas, mobile coverage is not good compared to what mobile coverage is in the city.
I would take exception with that on behalf of some of my carriers in many areas.
And let me just add as a data point, I think just looking at the map of Colorado, I think we have about 15,000 satellite subscribers in the state of Colorado. I don't know how that compares to the WISP population, but it's a pretty significant number of subscribers who've selected satellite over whatever alternatives that they have available to them.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Erwin, in areas where we do not have fixed wireless coverage, then satellite is the final option for those folks. And yes, it is available to them.
All right, another question from the audience. If you didn't identify yourself and pose your question.
Hi, my name is Brian Howard. I'm a legislative fellow with the National Congress of American Indians, and I have a question for Mr. Simmons. You mentioned that in your presentation that your company was doing extensive development near the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Reservation. And I was just curious, internet deployment on Indian lands is estimated at less than 10%, with basic analog telephone service only reaching around 68%. And I was curious as to whether or not your company had sought any partnerships with the tribal government with the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and if not, maybe perhaps highlight some reasons or potential obstacles that have prohibited such a partnership.
We have not. Am I live? We have not typically sought those opportunities. We've had some discussions with folks in that area. What we've done is brought our services in very close to a number of those particular communities, and that's why I think we're taking a very close look at the recent USF order, especially with the subset in tribal lands. While we may not be eligible for a lot of different reasons for those universal service funds, there might be other organizations that are. And if there's an opportunity for us to provide services as a jumping off point to communities in that particular area, if I put the map back up, you'd see actually that we're in 3 communities surrounding the reservation area and might have some opportunities to jump off our network into that area. We would welcome those opportunities to participate.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a question from the audience, and I have one question of my own to Mr. Simmons. You mentioned that you don't like the term broadband divide or digital divide.
Yes.
And my question to you is, I know that there are a lot of rural areas where they do have broadband and they do have access, But what about those people who live maybe 30 or 60 miles away from the central office? Do they also have those services?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, the build-out has begun and has been going on for quite some years. I think, frankly, the rural telephone companies in the areas that we serve has done an extraordinary job of building out their areas. A goodly number of them are providing components of voice, video, and data to a lot of their customers as well.
To the customers who are 30 and 60 miles away?
Well, who are, within their wire center area. There are still, I'm not for a moment saying that we do not have customers in our area or residents in our area who do not have access to broadband, no question. But I'm not sure the issue is in vast numbers, even the economic development components, as severe as might sometimes be noted by some who believe that we don't have services in that area. We've been pushing very hard and working.
Mr. Simmons, I'm sorry, but for time only, I'm going to have to interrupt you because I do have a question from the audience that needs to be asked.
Thank you.
But thank you for your very expansive answer. Today, the FCC treats pure play broadband providers, for example, WISPs that are not telephone or cable companies, differently than telephone companies. For example, pure broadband providers are not assured of obtaining pole attachments and cannot receive Connect America funding from the high-cost fund. As phone service moves from being a distinct service to being an app, how will the FCC remedy this disparate treatment, which already seems more and more to be arbitrary and to favor older and less innovative providers over newer, groundbreaking ones? And that is from Glass from Lariat.
Who would you like to address that?
Well,
I'll be glad to start to address it, and I would address it by asking, how will the FCC address this more and more glaring discrepancy?
Well, that's answering a question with a question, isn't it? Fortunately, I'm not an FCC commissioner. I'm only a state commissioner. Anybody have any other
Unfortunately,
answers?
I'm not an FCC commissioner. I'm FCC staff.
Anybody else?
Yeah, the question of if anybody's willing to expand upon the issue and the like, obviously that's an issue that the FCC has to be wrestling with. But to the extent anybody has any input that they think that we ought to be considering as we consider that issue, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing is that I talked a little bit ago about that it's not a technical issue, it's a policy issue, and I think this kind of goes to the heart of it, where I think we need to get to the point where we're funding broadband rather than POTS networks. And once we get to that point where we're funding broadband networks and getting that network in place from end to end, then I think, like they said, voice will just be one app of many apps that's going to be riding on that broadband pipe.
Question from the audience.
Not a question. I'm Steve Pastorkovich from Opasco. I'd like, since I'm not staff on any commission, I'd like to take the opportunity to address that last question a little bit. I think some of the biggest issues in the transition from supporting the PSTN to the CAF involves carrier of last resort obligations. A lot of the broadband providers who are using the new technologies or are not the quote-unquote old providers, they're not subject to carrier of last resort obligations. They're not subject to E911 obligations. There's a lot of regulatory obligations that the current providers have to live up to that the other broadband providers at this time do not. And how we make that transition is, I think, one of the issues that panels like this are, as well as the current proceedings, are designed to address.
Thank you for your comment. I see one more person who has a question, and we are out of time, so we will take that question and then we will.
Okay, sure. It's not so much of a question, but it's also it's a suggestion for you. My name is Rose Whiteherb. I'm the National Congress of American Indians. My research has also been with National Institutes of Health with 911 and emergency medical services. Not only, and this is just a transition. In talking about this transition, we had already done a lot of groundwork with the digital transition, and we were able to get that word out to the tribes. Not only do you need, with this transition, not only do you need a public safety voice in the standards body, you need tribal representation in every step of this move forward, and I want to make sure that we have that addressed. And I'm kind of sad that the other commissioners and other bodies here had left earlier. Some of the rural areas, Akwesasne Mohawk, for instance, Navajo Nation also, do not have real 911 services to this day. We have call forwarding of 911. So those 911 surcharges have been billed to our tribal people and our tribal population for almost 2 decades now. Arizona and New Mexico told the Navajo Nation that we will hold this money in trust until you have a service plan. So those monies are still there. And all I can suggest is that we continue to work closely with the tribes and that they're involved at every step of the process. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you to all the participants. And thank you all for being here and learning more about what we have to face and solve.
Okay. Thanks very much. And I do want to encourage anybody who can stay to stay and participate. And I wanted to introduce the next group or panel, which is identifying, evaluating, and transitioning key PSTN edge functionalities. The two sides really could have a conversation because this issue came up in the last panel, and it would be great to get input from everybody who can stay. Walter Johnston of our Public Safety Bureau is going to be moderating the panel, and I'll leave it to him. Thanks so much. I did want to make one announcement. We just do have 1 hour left in this room because there's an afternoon session. So I'm sure Walter will keep you all on track. Thanks.
All right.
Don't like. This one's on.
All right. This panel session is going to focus on a slightly different area involving this general topic, edge issues resulting from the transition. Not service provider issues, but issues caused by the transition of service providers. I will note, just as a way of introduction, something stuck in my head for years. Andy Grove, who was the former chairman of Intel, made a remarkable statement in the 90s. In a magazine interview, he said he was musing about how he was sideswiped by the Internet. And what I found remarkable about that was that the Internet at that point in time was 20 years old. And what's apparent is that even though changes that are fundamental that take decades to accomplish, the impact on those changes are often seismic events on the people affected. And this is the case with broadband. Broadband, by how you want to count it, is 20 or 30 years in progress at the current time. But its impact as a tipping point is being felt in industry groups, businesses, and we want to try to focus on how we identify people impacted by the change, how we identify the scope of the change, and how we better manage the change on people who are impacted in a disruptive fashion by these technologies. So we're going to lead off with Brian Daly from AT&T. Brian?
Okay, thank you, Walter. I do have a slide deck. When we look at the edge devices, and the whole topic of this is identifying, evaluating, and transitioning key PSTN edge functionalities, there are many devices out there that have an RG11 connection that connect up to the telephone network today for one reason or another. One of the biggest questions that the Technological Advisory Committee is dealing with is what is the definition of the PSTN, and this is one of the fundamental issues that I think needs to be addressed when we look at this whole transition, because as mentioned on the previous panel, the PSTN or the network today does include a lot of digital technology in it. Most of the network switching fabric and most of the network itself uses packet switch network technologies. So That's one of the questions that first need to be answered. Then you need to look at the various aspects of what users are out there using PSTN technology, everything from the residential users to the business enterprise users to the government, public safety, and military users. And then what devices are those users counting on for that connection to the internet or to the PSTN. Obviously, the plain old telephone service or POTS service is the very basic, and that's the voice service. Next that comes in mind certainly are fax services, but there's many other devices out there that connect up to the traditional phone networks today. And there are still a lot of users using the traditional dial-up modems, contrary to the belief that the dial-up modem has fallen by the wayside. They are still out there. There's also other devices such as satellite TV receivers, your basic subscription services, gaming, and so forth, which can be used over those satellite networks, require telephone connections. From the enterprise systems, we have alarm systems, ATM machines, faxes, credit card transactions, and then you have your basic payphones, which still exist out there. So there's a number of devices that need to be identified and categorized under the different areas of use. When evaluating, it's a matter of looking at the services that are provided by those devices, anything from the voice services and associated features to the fax machines to the accessibility aspects such as TTY to some of the public safety aspects like E911, CALIA, GETS, wireless priority service, and TSP. There's also programs such as the basic telephone services for low-income customers, security, backup power, and schools, libraries, and rural healthcare programs. It's also important to look at various assets such as the equipment and the facilities that are out there. Many of the residences are wired today with the old twisted pair, and that's a lot of copper assets that are out there and a lot of equipment that connects to those copper assets. So how do you maintain those or replace those if you need to upgrade equipment? There's also various categories of communications we can look at. There's always-on communications, which are leased lines for things like ATMs or point-of-sale systems. There's on-demand communications, such as used by fax machines, dial-up internet, the personal assistant devices and medical devices that we heard about, and also the satellite TV on-demand services. Next, we have event-driven communications such as security and alarm systems, environmental monitoring systems, and backup systems for primary communications, and batch communication systems such as point-of-sale, metering and monitoring, and turnstile and usage counting systems. When we look at transitioning the network, there's a matter of transitioning the facilities, which I already mentioned. Do we look at using existing wiring and just interfacing to that existing wiring, or have new wiring? Transitioning of the equipment to broadband-enabled equipment, transitioning the services, such as to wireless phones, use of email, instant messaging, blogs, and social networking sites in lieu of voice communications, and also transition of the regulatory aspects, the support for emergency communications, equal accessibility, and consumer protection. And when we look at broadband networks, it's also important to understand that we're not just talking about one type of IP network or the internet. There's various types of access networks that we heard about, everything from 4G wireless to cable to unlicensed to DSL to the core networks where we have operator-managed IP networks using an IMS, the internet, and private IP networks. And then finally, I just want to close real quick, if I may, with a scene out of The Big Bang Theory, where we've got connecting an X10 receiver to a lamp, and they actually have the signal go around the world to light the lamp that's sitting next to them. The important part of this is, do you know where your packets have been? If you've got an important application like a medical or alarm system, you want to make sure you understand where your packets are going and have a trusted managed network.
Okay, we're going to go to Harold Feld right now from Public Knowledge.
Okay. conscious of the time here. I'm going to speak in very general terms about the importance of principles with regard to this. This is not the first technical transition that the FCC has had to manage. Cable is right now transitioning to digital cable. We've had the DTV transition. We've had past upgrades of the PSTN and the wireless networks. What we've learned in all of these is there's always surprises. There are always people who don't get the message before the transition. There are people who don't realize that their technology is dependent upon the existing network. There's folks out there you just don't know about. And that means that the key takeaway is you have to design any transition mechanism to handle surprises. This doesn't mean that we don't try to figure out what's going to happen and plan for it. We need to do a lot of cataloging, outreach, figuring out what's out there and contacting everyone we can. But the fact is, and the more we do that, the better we'll be able to handle the surprises. But the fact is that one of the things that has consistently tripped up the FCC and the industry as it has tried to move forward in these things, and I have just two words to say for those who have done the DTV transition: wireless microphones, to understand that there can be a lot of surprises even in what we think is a well-understood area. Getting the principles right for transition is important because it will guide us in how to proceed and in what to protect when we come up with something unexpected. Is our primary goal to keep consumers whole? Is our primary goal to maximize competition or maintain national reliability? Is this about promoting innovation? Obviously, we want all of these things, but history shows us that there are often trade-offs between competing principles. In keeping this in mind, we should understand the PSTN is very heavily populated. It's nationwide, reliable, and thanks to the Carter phone and Part 68 rules and the computer proceedings, it has been an open general-purpose network for about 40 years now. That means a lot of people are using it for a lot of things and have been doing so for so long that they forget that they're dependent upon a particular technology path. The previews of what problems we might run into: in 2004 and 2005, the FCC deregulated fiber and eliminated Computer 3 obligations, even on the existing wireline providers. The focus there was on deploying broadband. It was all about broadband, and there was little official attention or concern about the impact to edge services. Now, these dockets had been open for years. There were extensive public proceedings. Arguably, it was one of the most publicized questions that the FCC was dealing with, other than media ownership. But when the changes actually occurred, large segments of the industry were caught by surprise. We continue to see this with copper loop retirement. Every time we have copper loop retirement, there turns out to be some segment of localized industry that's dependent upon access to the copper loop that suddenly wakes up and discovers they're no longer able to provide service to their customers, and customers who discover that they're no longer able to get the service that they need. I would suggest that part of this is because the FCC went into these initial proceedings with a very clear goal of wanting to promote deployment of broadband and fiber, and did not adequately consider what other principles might be at stake and what they would need to consider. The final question I want to leave folks with regard to the principles is this. Do we intend to maintain the character of the PSTN as an open, general-purpose network, or do we simply want to preserve existing services and allow networks to shift to closed networks, provided that they keep consumers whole in the sense of not increasing price over much and generally maintaining the availability of existing services? Either one of these is possible at this point, and at the moment, given the regulatory structure, we're heading much more down the path of the second than the first. The nature of the transition is going to hinge very much on this core question, and because it's a very difficult question, there's a lot of incentive to put it off and not want to talk about it. But from my perspective, it would be a shame to lose this quality of openness in the PSTN and its value as a reliable nationwide general purpose network. I mean, I know I'm repeating that phrase, but I think it's really important for people to think of the PSTN in that way. I think it would be a shame to lose this quality of openness, but it would be inexcusable to lose this quality of openness in an absence of mind or from a failure for us to consider these questions in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to shift now to Steve Hudak from Vonage.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Walter, for having us here. Stephen Hudak from Vonage. As you mentioned, I represent our global technical support, Tier 3 engineering, and E911 operations. So, as you can tell, I'm interested in both the voice of the customer and the engineering backend. Today I want to talk about how it's best when the industry works to enable services to ride seamlessly over broadband networks. I bring today the excitement of Vonage as an award-winning voice-over technology provider, and the fact that we offer the customers high-quality, affordable, feature-rich voice services. But we wouldn't be able to do that without functioning as an over-the-top voice service, and we utilize the capabilities of our customers' broadband connection. We're running many services and applications such as email, photo sharing, streaming video, and others that run over customers' existing broadband connections. Vonage's success demonstrates the growing market for products, services, and applications designed to ride over these networks. Consumers benefit from the availability of these services that Vonage can provide, and they fuel the competition in the market for the services and bring consumers increased choice, innovative services features, and competitive prices. Our experience demonstrates that it's possible to indeed best to work when industry enables the services, once again, to ride seamlessly over the broadband networks. And thanks to the T38 fax relay standard, physical fax machines work today on VoIP technology. And because Vonage's ATAs work like traditional phones, traditional answering machines work as well. Best of all, they can choose between existing hardware and moving Vonage's innovative feature-rich software voicemail platform or utilizing that answering machine. There's also many home alarm and home monitoring companies around that provide alternate solutions to their customers on mobile only or VoIP only households. The use of GSM transmission from their equipment has enabled these companies to work where PSTN usage is declining. ATM and credit card machines are already in the Ethernet space, providing secure monetary transactions for businesses and consumers. These are but a few examples of the ability of the industry to evolve as networks evolve. As the FCC considers the transition away from the PSTN, it should support the industry's efforts to develop standards and technology solutions to enable existing technology services to the transition as well. Thanks.
Okay, Bill Belt now from the Consumer Electronics Association.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you to the FCC for inviting me. My name is Bill Belt, and I'm with the Consumer Electronics Association here in Arlington, Virginia. For those that don't know, let me give a brief background on who the CEA is. Then I'm going to move into some of the devices that we see will be stranded in the network, some consumer electronics devices that will be stranded in the network. First, CEA is 2,000 member companies representing about $190 billion in U.S. sales in 2011 alone. Worldwide, it's something closer to about $1 trillion in sales this year, but $190 billion. And I want to emphasize that number so that we can better compare the sort of stranded assets to what we're talking about in the marketplace today. For those of you that will be able to attend our International Consumer Electronics Show in January in Las Vegas, you'll walk through nearly 1.8 million square feet of floor space, see thousands of companies displaying devices that are almost always all digital, almost always IP. Even devices that just a couple years ago weren't connected to anything are now connected, and they're connected digitally and through IP networks. Camcorders, cameras, TVs are all connected devices today. There is certainly decline in sales in some of the traditional devices that relied on the analog PSTN network, decline in prices, and in fact decline in household penetration of these devices. But as noted by other panelists, the sort of embedded number of these devices still ranges in the millions. I'm going to focus on just 3 of them to give you some ideas. The fax machine, cordless telephone, landline phones, and telephone answering devices. So let me talk about fax machines for a moment. In fax machines in 2010 sold about 720,000 units. The average price of a fax machine is $114, and this represents about a 10% household penetration rate. At its height, which is sort of in the 2001-2002 timeframe, fax machines represented about a 12% penetration rate in households. Cordless telephones last year in 2010 sold about 11 million, almost 12 million units. The average price of a cordless telephone is an astonishing $17. Cordless telephone penetration rate in a household is now down to 75%. This is not just cordless and landline phones. 75%. At its height, it was a little over 96%, we calculate. So that's a huge, huge drop. And finally, telephone answering devices. Telephone answering devices in 2010 sold about 15 million units. The average selling price for telephone answering devices is $48. They are down to about 74% in household penetration. At their height, they were about 78% household penetration. And even my latest numbers, which are 2011 for telephone answering devices, show further decline, sort of astonishing decline really, at 67% household penetration. The point of all this is, yes, there are millions of these devices out in people's households. People rely on them. They rely on them for important products, for important services to fulfill important needs. But the numbers are declining. They're declining remarkably fast. They are being replaced by new and better devices that are providing new and better services, often at lower prices. As Stephen mentioned a couple minutes ago, even some of these devices which appear might be stranded will in fact have solutions provided for them in terms of other sort of services and adapters out there. So it's not as bleak, I think, as maybe Harold might see it. I always try to be very optimistic. Well, I try to be very optimistic. So it is something people should be watching and paying attention to, but we're seeing the migration happen sort of naturally in the marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to hear now from Venkatesh Basapur from Telcordia Technologies. I hope I did justice to your name.
That's perfectly fine. Again, good afternoon. It's call me Venki, just to be short. It's Venki Basapur from Telcordia Technologies. Once again, thanks for inviting me on this panel. This subject matter, of course, is of great interest as a consumer, first, to begin with many edge devices of this sort that we were talking about, and also as a technologist, having worked in the industry to worry about backward compatibility, interoperability, reliability, and things like that on behalf of our service provider customers. So in some sense, as the previous session went through, the circuit to packet transformation is something that's here to stay, and it's sort of somewhat inevitable given the market forces, and also brings many opportunities. Actually, it's good to follow after Bill because I'm also an optimist in this area, and it's good to hear that many of these there is a device transformation taking place as well. So, but nevertheless, there are standards bodies where there is quite a few dedicated people and organizations that continue to work on this issue of backward compatibility, some level of transparency, and also feature functionality sort of equivalence. They all come with a cost. To some extent, you can maintain those things, but at the same time, I think the focus needs to be also on the new edge devices that are coming into the marketplace and how you can leverage that. I think one of the most important things, exciting things that the IP-enabled devices bring to the marketplace is the multimedia. So in some sense, even whether it is commercial services or emergency response, it brings some innovative ways of how these services could be provided, which is something to focus on and leverage as well. So To some extent, the basic feature functionality is something that, while it's important, too much preoccupation on that might sort of miss the other alternative ways of providing service or even improving the existing set of services. Having said that, I do have some concerns in the sense one of the 2 or 3 changes that are taking place. One is, at any given instance, there would be multiple service providers involved in providing the communication service. So there is a traditional provider of the layer 1 service, perhaps over the top service providers, there could be multiple. So one issue is there is a greater responsibility on a consumer in terms of managing their own edge devices. So it's, somebody talked about surprises. So there are a lot of surprises. And one is in terms of awareness or an education an average consumer might need. So to some extent, the PST, some of the devices that were used before were dumbed down, and to some extent there were plug and play options. But now with these kinds of devices, you have almost a network of your own at home, even in a simple home with 3 or 4 devices that are interconnected. So things like home networking, security, configuring the equipment, how do you solve edge device problems, who do you call if there are multiple service providers providing the service. These are some of the bigger issues that I think is going to sort of have to be answered. I think the biggest area is that just the consumer awareness. It's just the awareness and the education regarding ownership and responsibility for managing these edge devices is never so much, has been on the consumer as ever before. So that, to me, is a big area of concern, and that's something that needs my increased focus. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Our final panelist is Richard Hinkson from Honeywell Security. I'll note that security systems and telecommunications has had a long and beneficial history and a lot of interdependencies, so I'm interested to hear Honeywell's viewpoint.
Good, thank you. Yes, as you said, we've been dealing with transitions and changes in the phone networks over the years and with the cables coming in. In fact, we've had to even deal with the dedicated lines that were brought up before. We used to use dedicated copper, and then we had to go to switch circuits and so on. I guess alarm communications are important. There are a number of different types you have out there. One is the panic. You hear a noise in the middle of the night, you want to get the police there. Traditional burglary, where you might not be at home, but you still want to have your property protected. Fire, that goes without saying. And then medical, there's a couple of different types. One is, I'm having a heart attack in the middle of the night, I need an ambulance. The other part is they're starting to get like a monitoring activity. Did grandma take her medicine? Is grandma up and about the house? You don't have to be on the premises to see if they're feeling okay. All of these use the communications. As far as the systems out there, there's about 20 to 22 million monitored systems, meaning the central station companies like an ADT or Brinks or something like that monitor the systems. Of these, we're estimating there's still 12 to 15 million units on POTS systems. In a lot of cases, to change these over, you have to take out the entire system and replace it with a new all-in-one system. And these things have a long life. Some of them are still out there that were in the 70s and we had pulse dialing going, and they're still alive. I'm not saying pulse dialing has to stay around. One of our big concerns, I'm sorry, skipped. Communications requirements for a system that we need, it's got to be robust. And the example came up before about the earthquake. I was up in New York when we just had a bare tremor up there, and our cellular system came down to the ground. You couldn't get a call through because everybody was saying, what was that? They've got to be available 24/7. They have to remain functional during power outages. We've got UL requirements that says for a fire system you have to have 24-hour battery backup on the system, and it should be able to go all the way to the central station. You have to have good fidelity on it regardless of the traffic loading, so if you get high traffic you don't want it to start distorting things. And there's a couple of parts to this configuration stable. You have firmware updates coming out. One is the downtime during an update can cause a missed alarm. When we dealt with this with the cable companies years ago, they said, well, we only do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we said, well, does that mean you can't have a heart attack at 2 o'clock in the morning because your cable modem's going to be down for 15 minutes, while a firmware upgrade goes in? The other thing is, if you do a firmware upgrade, it shouldn't change your signal fidelity. A lot of times these happen out of the blue. Nobody has advanced warning, and suddenly the alarm system stops working. And the central stations are going around trying to figure out why. And it turns out somebody did a software upgrade or changed the characteristics. The traffic has to go through. A big concern also is with the power. Right now with a POTS network, you've got the telco provides all of the power for the communications. We provide, in the alarm industry, have our own backup batteries, but the telephone line stays up. There's a big battery there with a big generator. So you can stay up for days in case of a power failure. With the newer networks, you're finding now we've got 4 sets of batteries out here. You've got one to put your network interface in the house. You've got pole amplifiers that are out there, or transmitters, as well as the provider has the thing. These things are only set for maybe 4 hours of standby time, and then you see people going around with trucks and generators trying to charge the batteries. All it takes is one of these to die, and a lot of people could have no security system. I'll skip over this. There's a couple of prevalent formats out there. One uses pulse DTMF dialing, like Touchtone. Another uses FSK, an older modem format, and some are pulses of tones. Don't know if this is going to go through, but I had some examples of messages that come out over the line. Don't know if the sound will work. Okay. That was a normal contact ID message that could be sending a fire alarm. We've had one case where the telephone company did a software upgrade and the speed got changed and they left a digit out on us. So you hear the speed changed on that. And this was just done over a weekend, no warning. And then another case, somebody came in, and we call it the circuses in town because it sounds like a calliope to me. This was one of the cable providers made a change. A little different. And this is a graphical representation of it. The top is what a good message looks like. You got distinct pulses, and you lost a digit, and the bottom one, I don't know what that is.
And we're about out of time.
Right. Just summing up, newer systems, we're going over to GSM and IP. We also have some interfaces which can do conversion. We are working on that, but it's going to take some time to do. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Maybe to start off, I'd like to get back to something Harold said, which actually is very linked to a question we got from Apple. But as one of the things, I've been through a number of transitions, and what you said is exactly the case. You only find out the damage you're doing as you're into the transition. How can we change that? So I'll open this to anybody, but I'll start with Harold. How do we engage the people who are likely to be impacted by this to better understand what the issues are likely to be?
Well, on the one hand, it's hard. I would say that we're fortunate that there is a lengthy ongoing process of transition right now. I mean, this is, as the chairman noted at the beginning and others have noted, this is a process that's already occurring in the market. So to a certain extent, there is already a incentive in the marketplace and with the major trade associations and product developers to be thinking about how to deal with the issue of compatibility between multiple networks and backwards compatibility of devices. At the same time, the biggest challenges are going to be for consumers, for small operators. I think one of the important lessons from the DTV transition actually was that the FCC leveraged local consumer organizations, public interest organizations, and others to help get the word out locally about the Converter Box program. And just advise people of, hey, this is coming. We heard from one of the other panelists earlier that the phone companies went to elementary schools in previous times to, let them know about these kinds of changes. I think that the commission is just going to have to be very creative about leveraging these things as we move forward, and to also, as I stress again, just recognize you're never going to catch everything, and therefore the important thing is to have set up in advance some idea of what you're going to do when the surprise happens. Because my personal experience with the limited number of transitions that I've been in is that people think they've thought of everything, and it gets rolled out, and then something that nobody anticipated comes up, and everybody has to spend a couple of months at a minimum rethinking, so what are we going to do about this specific case, as opposed to kind of thinking at the beginning, we know there are going to be some surprises, we ought to think about what's our process going to be when the surprise comes up.
Bill, let me try to draw an answer out from you. I know we're working through the TAC with the CEA on some IPv6 evolution issues. Working outreach to trade groups, would that hold some promise to better understand some of the issues associated with this?
You know, I think it will, and it honestly often does. We worked very closely with the Commission during the DTV transition to great success. We have tremendous access, not just to a huge, group of companies, in the case of CEA, over 2,000 companies, but by extension, we have access to, hundreds of thousands, millions possibly of consumers, consumers of these products and services. So that is one of the ways that the Commission has done this kind of work in the past, and one in which we would, encourage them to do it in the future. Places like CEA, but not only CEA, are often one-stop shopping, everything from, trade show and marketing and research to standard setting. We're accredited by the American National Standards Institute to write standards for our industry. So it's a sort of a good, easy place to go for a bunch of things all at once.
Okay. Richard, let me get back to an issue you raised.
Sure.
You mentioned, I'll say, a deficit associated with powering in the new technology that I think most people would agree was better done in the old technology. My experience is that new technologies bring in new capabilities, but it's never a seamless transition. There are certain things the new technology is never going to be able to do. How do we decide on, one, what changes, sunset capabilities we'll have to accept that people might consider a cost of the transition, and what time intervals should we be looking at in terms of if we're going to adopt a change that impacts an industry group? What time periods should that transition be allowed?
I don't have an exact number, but I mean, it's been going in cycles. We started dealing with the loss of telephone when we were going to a cellular thing, and then they sunsetted analog on us. So everybody was transitioning over to GSM at that point. So I mean, the technology is transitioning faster than anybody can catch up. I mean, you just about get implemented in it, and the standards change.
But if we're going to stay with the concept of a sunset period,
right,
how do we define what items should be sunsetted, and how do we define what the sunset period is? I'm interested in any suggestions. Harold, do you want a spot?
Well, again, it goes back to what's the guiding principle going to be. If the guiding principle is going to be that from a consumer-facing side, and this has traditionally been when we've done these transitions for telephone service, both for wireline and wireless, one of the most important principles has been the consumer shouldn't experience a dramatic change, or the consumer should not experience a significant increase in cost. There are always going to be a couple of holdouts, but I remember being a customer in the first in the transition from analog to digital wireless phone, and the way it got handled was that my cellular company sent me a new phone in the mail and said, put your old phone in here and send it back to us. This is now your new phone. So we kind of said, you guys in industry are going to have to deal with a set of costs in order to protect consumer expectations. In the kind of industry to industry, it seems that there's obviously going to be consideration about efficiency, about cost, You reach a point where it says it's not worth it to spend millions of dollars on an industry-wide basis necessarily to maintain a service, unless, of course, it's one of these that people's lives depend on. And then we become a lot more cautious. So I wish there were a magic formula around this. I think that in some ways, it's going to be a combination of sunsets and backward compatibility for the most essential services. And also, finally, just as we did in the DTV transition, ultimately, we may need to persuade Congress to just allocate some amount of money. And I know, particularly in these times, that's difficult to contemplate. But we ultimately did allocate federal money to help keep consumers whole in the DTV transition, and we may come to a point where we just have to persuade Congress that they need to allocate some money in order to protect the legitimate consumer expectations in this space.
Brian, as a service provider, any thoughts in terms of transition periods?
Well, as already mentioned, the transition is underway already, and it's occurring naturally, just because of what we're seeing as the evolution of networks and consumer devices. Going back, one point I do want to make on you asked the question about what can consumers give up, and the issue of power, I think you had mentioned. Well, as Bill had mentioned earlier, a lot of people are going to cordless phones today, and one of the things we learned in the Pacific Northwest during a snowstorm a couple of years ago is many people lost their traditional landline phones because they have cordless phones. What do they have? Batteries. The batteries go out. They're not powered by the central office. So we're already seeing they're giving up some of those features just by the natural evolution of consumer devices today. And one other contrast to the DTV transition, that was really focused on one particular segment. You had a broadcaster on one side that had to change their equipment over to digital equipment, and you had consumers' TVs that needed to either be replaced or provide a converter box. Well, with this whole evolution of the PSTN, we're looking at much broader segments of consumer devices and much broader vertical segments delivering those services. So it's not just to provide a converter box anymore. It's really a bigger issue that needs to be tackled by industry trade associations, as mentioned earlier, but also standards organizations looking at things like machine-to-machine standards, which is a big area right now, and how do you evolve into a standardized set of communication protocols that machines can use to talk to one another.
Okay. One of the questions that was submitted dealt with the fact that the wireless technology, cellular, is often viewed as a partial substitute for some of the reliability capabilities. I know I was without power for 5 days recently, and between my cell phone and Starbucks, we managed to survive in terms of 5 days without communications. Are there any issues, regulatory or technical, in terms of looking at these sort of cross-technology substitution strategies that you're aware of or might preclude further expansion of those strategies?
Well, yeah, again, I think part of the key issue is, one, we need to keep in mind that cellular coverage is not equal throughout the country. And one of the unfortunate tendencies is we here in Washington tend to judge by the Washington area market, which has excellent coverage and lots of I shouldn't say lots of, but at least a choice of broadband providers, and we're in one of the wealthiest areas of the country where people that all of the providers love to serve, and that it's economic for them to serve us. When we move into other areas of the country, we begin to enter a universe where not all of these backup strategies are going to be equally available. We move also into a concern about the economic feasibility. I can have both a landline and a wireless contract and not worry about it too much on my monthly bill, but not everybody is in the same situation. And I would suggest that when it comes to things like reliability, that we ought to be cognizant of the fact that one of the things that has allowed us to see the evolution of best effort service is that when there was always one 5 nines reliable network alternative for those who wanted to pay for it, for whom it was accessible. That's the PSTN. And no matter where you live in the state, the PSTN has to come out and serve you. And if that measurement of reliability goes away because we are depending upon cross-platform strategies, I would be concerned that we've taken the floor away, and I'm not sure that everybody is going to have access to a set of reliable alternatives.
Anybody else? All right, then let me ask a follow-up question. When we look at the future problem, it seems, and I'll keynote off of Harold, there was a time there was 5 nines reliability. That was defined or imposed by something called the Bell system. When we look at the participants in this brave new world, it's much more fragmented. Many new players, some of them have regulations, some of them are unregulated. How do we create a common language out of what might be a Tower of Babel? How do we impose a system view when there's so many participants in terms of people bringing a piece of the solution to the table?
I'm the only one who doesn't sell a product, so I'm the only one who can speak freely.
By the way, I'm not grading the answers, so you can afford to be wrong.
This is obviously the critical question. I do think it starts with interconnectivity, with interconnection rather, and that one way that may hold promise in this space is first ensure that these services interconnect with one another, and then second, something that would be the equivalent of the emergency alert system or otherwise available in times of emergency, where every system has to cooperate with each, it has to interconnect and then also cooperate and prioritize emergency traffic, and that those situations are obviously going to be difficult to build. There are a lot of questions, even in the EAS system, which is a much simpler system, relatively speaking, a much smaller universe. We still have questions over who gets to activate it. How do we just had our first nationwide test where we learned that we have a long way to go in terms of solving, nationwide coordination on even something relatively straightforward like that. So I don't pretend this problem is easy, but I do think that it starts with making sure all of the players can interconnect with each other, and then it builds off of that.
If I can add to that, PSTN had a number of such industry-wide interconnected services type testing. Those activities used to take place. Now with the cross industry, I'm not sure it's the same level of testing or cross-platform type testing that takes place. So one solution is to sort of in a public, in a consumer forum or in public places to do these kinds of not just demonstrative things, but more testing to make sure that there is a device connectivity. There is also cross multiple service provider type connectivity. So I think one way is to promote more testing, and I think we also talked about surprises before. I think one and the only way of objectively eliminating any kind of surprises is to test, continuously test and constantly test.
Let me, interesting point, Harold. Let me expand, and this is relevant to Telcordia, but one of the reasons I can communicate across the PSTN is that there's a number of critical databases available to all participants. Maybe the most fundamental and perhaps the most trivial is just the addressing scheme is an openly administered addressing scheme. One of the earlier speakers on another panel talked about closed communication systems. And I'll point to things like, it started out at least as closed systems, things like Facebook and Skype initially. Do we have a problem going to the future in terms of providing the data elements necessary for this openness of communications that you were describing? In a broadband environment, how do I ensure that I have the ability to go platform to platform and make a communication in a future environment where I might be making a PSTN-like call to somebody who might be served, say, by a Facebook-like platform? Any thoughts? Brian.
Yeah, there are some standards in place today to allow that. For example, to go from an internet address or a SIP URI to a telephone number, PSTN 10-digit number. But it isn't universal, as you're saying. You can't do that to a Facebook platform or to some other proprietary platform. Certainly standards are needed in that area, and back to the comment on interoperability testing. Well, before that testing needs to become a set of interoperability standards that are going to ensure each of the environments are able to communicate and interoperate with one another, and part of that is going to be what you mentioned, is a mechanism for allowing that communication to occur between those different domains.
Anybody else? Harold?
I think that what we need to be wary about is the tension between the platform providers and providers of services. On the one hand, platform providers, generally both network providers and platform providers like Facebook or Google, want to be as compatible as possible with numerous offerings. At the same time, they have an interest in trying to monetize that compatibility, and the calculation on this is very different for a Facebook than it is for a startup. And the chief concern that I would have going forward about this is if we leave all of this to the market unsupervised, not only do we get very patchwork results, but we don't even know what the patchwork looks like until things start going wrong. And I think that while it's unclear, I think at this point, what the approach the Commission should take, I certainly think that it's the right question for the Commission to be asking what's going on in the market right now with regard to this question of compatibility, and where might there be potential problems in ensuring that enough information is shared to make sure that we have this kind of compatibility and reliability.
Bill, you have the last comment.
Great, thank you. Playing off something that Brian said before and what Harold was just saying. So we've been talking for the last few minutes about testing and connectivity and interoperability. These are, in my mind, as an employee of an American National Standards Institute accredited trade association, these are concepts that cry out for standards. And I just sort of, not to purposely take the opposite view of Harold, but I do want to say that the unsupervised market has been quite effective in writing standards. Industry-led standards have bought us all of this, have bought us, all this freedom, all this digital, innovation that we're seeing today. So I personally have no fears of an unsupervised, marketplace going out and writing the standards that'll bring us the interconnectivity and the testing that we need. Thank you.
All right.
I know you promised Bill the last word, but I just twice now I've had this problem of Bill thinking that what I'm saying is either negative about the current state of the world or a call for some sort of government seizure of the standards process. And my point is actually really very different. My point is I think that the FCC leads best here through saying what should the industry be looking at, not by dictating how it does it, but by making clear that the priorities are going to be, protect reliability or protect consumers or, protect innovation, and that industry is responsive to this kind of leadership of setting the priorities in a very clear way. I also think that there is a minimum amount of just information gathering that the commission needs to be engaged in. I know that sometimes people get nervous when the commission shows up at standards meetings or starts asking questions like this because they think that it must inevitably lead to regulation. But I do want to just recall that one of the things that was important when we did the Y2K transition, which was something of a transition, was simply the commission being a resource of information, sending people out, showing that they cared about it, but leaving the solution and the heavy lifting to industry. And I think that whatever turns out to be necessary in this environment, and in this case, I don't think anybody can predict what regulatory approach it should be. That nevertheless, if the commission were to simply, leave this to the private sector without even looking over their shoulder, I think we could be buying ourselves serious problems down the road.
All right, thank you. And as my son said when he was a child, you have the another last word, Harold.
I want to thank everybody for participating. This was obviously a very robust discussion, and thanks so much again.